Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. My name is Anthony. Ever since I can remember, I've lived in a mid-sized town in Oregon. Not particularly exciting, but with reasonable job opportunities. Shortly after completing a technical course in manufacturing, I landed a job at a paper packaging factory nestled in the industrial district. It wasn't a dream job, but it paid the bills. I started as a production assistant, responsible for checking paper rolls, organizing machines, and keeping everything in order before the team arrived. I enjoyed that routine. I'd arrive early, put on my uniform, clock in, and greet colleagues while the machines warmed up. Each morning, I'd wipe them down with a damp cloth, removing dust and residue. There was something almost therapeutic about it. With each dawn, I felt I was building my independence. The factory was in an industrial zone, somewhat removed from downtown. A large warehouse with a high ceiling that muffled street noise, but intensified the sound of the machines inside. We practically communicated through gestures. Still, the environment was tolerable, and the supervisors kept everything organized. The main one, Matthew, had been with the company for several years and tended to be firm in his demands, but also attentive to those who showed effort. A few weeks after taking that position, I noticed a different atmosphere. Those working in shipping commented that a new employee would be joining the production sector. They didn't give many details, only saying that it was someone new to reinforce the team. No one knew whether she would do the heavy work or stay in the administrative sector. I didn't pay much attention, as I was concerned with meeting overdue delivery targets. Around 9 o'clock on that Monday morning, I saw the side door open. A woman of medium height entered, with black hair tied in a ponytail and a confident air. Beside her came Nadia, the head of human resources. They went straight to the supervisor's office. I tried to continue my work, but couldn't help but observe. In a few minutes, Nadia and the newcomer crossed the sector to introduce the woman to the staff. Everyone, this is Fiona. She'll be helping with the cutting and pressing part. Pleasure, said Fiona, smiling without much ceremony. Her smile had something captivating, though contained. We exchanged quick glances. I noticed a tattoo on her wrist. It seemed like a complex symbol that I couldn't identify. I didn't give it much importance, but mentally noted that she seemed different from other people who arrived there. As the weeks passed, I began to notice strange behaviors. Fiona barely touched the machines, despite having been hired precisely for that. She spent much of her time in Matthew's office. When we looked through the glass partition, there they were, the two of them drinking coffee, laughing, talking. We couldn't hear what they were saying, but the atmosphere was one of complicity. Some colleagues even joked that she had become his personal assistant. The lunchtime gossip was that Matthew seemed completely involved with the new employee. I heard comments of all kinds, from those who praised Fiona's beauty to those who said she must have some influence to not have to get her hands dirty. There were even those who doubted everything and thought it was just kindness from the supervisor. But inside, I felt uncomfortable. It seemed unfair that we ran around to deliver orders, while she apparently had perks. One Wednesday, I needed to take a production report to Matthew's office. I entered and found Fiona sitting in his chair, swinging from side to side, with Matthew standing next to her. He smiled awkwardly. "Need something, Anthony?" he asked, extending his hand to take my reports. I handed him the papers and noticed that she was looking at me with a certain indifference. As I left, I noticed that the tattoo on her wrist was more intricate than I thought, intertwining lines that formed a kind of web. I tried not to think about it too much, but the image stuck in my head. The routine continued. After a little more than a month, rumors started that Fiona was the mother of 3 children, and that she had had turbulent relationships. Some female colleagues said she was dangerous, that she liked married men, and that this had already caused problems in previous jobs. Others claimed she was just a woman trying her luck. I remained neutral, but I confess she intrigued me. One afternoon, after hours, I stayed at the company to finish some last-minute cuts. The place was almost empty, with few lights on. While checking the control panel of one of the machines, I heard voices in the distance. I turned off the display and slowly headed toward the sound. I don't usually like gossip, but something led me to spy. Upon reaching an iron door, I recognized Fiona's voice. She was speaking in an exalted tone. "I do what you ask, but I want you to keep your part. Don't let me down." I couldn't hear Matthew's response, but I perceived that they were arguing. I felt uncomfortable and went back to finish my work. I had the impression that there was strong tension between the two. The next day, Fiona appeared smiling as if nothing had happened, and Matthew showed up with dark circles under his eyes, quiet. This only reinforced my sense of strangeness. About 2 more weeks passed. During this interval, Fiona received constant visits in the office. The production line staff wasn't even surprised anymore. What drew attention was that Matthew began arriving at work with suspicious marks on his arms, neck, and even face. He gave vague explanations, mentioning falls or bumps on corners. No one was foolish. Most suspected that his wife had discovered something and was demanding satisfaction. Meanwhile, Fiona continued to be seen with him around the neighborhood, in bars and restaurants. My personal life was stable. I helped my mother pay the rent, didn't have a girlfriend, and dedicated my free hours to online management courses. I wanted to grow in the company. Even with all that confusion, I saw in my work a path of progress. But then everything changed. I arrived at the factory on a Tuesday morning, as usual. I greeted the porter and crossed the yard to the main warehouse. Some people were whispering, indicating something serious. I tried to ask a colleague, but he just signaled that I should go talk to the supervisor. Upon reaching the section where Matthew used to stay, I found one of the managers with a very serious expression. "Anthony, we had a complicated problem. Matthew fell ill here in production a few minutes ago and fainted. The ambulance arrived, but there were no vital signs. He died. That hit me like a punch. I had never witnessed someone die like that in the work environment. The manager informed me that the family would be notified, and that meanwhile, the factory would close early that day. There was an immediate call from the CIPA, Internal Commission, for accident prevention personnel. and standard investigation procedures began. I gathered my things, still unable to believe it, trying to process the news. Before leaving, I looked around for Fiona, but didn't see her. Many colleagues wondered if she had any connection to what happened, though no one spoke of it openly. The official comment was that Matthew had suffered a massive heart attack, possibly caused by stress. 2 days later, the factory owner, Mr. Lawson, called me to talk in his office. I was nervous, but he received me with cordiality. "Anthony, we need a new production supervisor. You're hardworking, understand the machines, and have a good relationship with the team. I thought of offering you this position." I was speechless for a few seconds. Matthew's death still lingered in my head, but I felt a pang of pride. I said I accepted, that I appreciated the confidence, and committed to doing my best. It wasn't easy to replace someone so important, but I was willing to try. With the promotion, I had my own office and more responsibilities. I prepared reports, organized schedules, and supervised the cutting and assembly process. I soon realized that Fiona didn't like the change very much. Before, she had privileges with Matthew. Now I expected her to effectively fulfill production functions. In the first days, she would come to my office with smiles and subtle conversations, asking if I needed help with reports or if I wanted coffee. I thanked her, but made it clear that it would be better for her to focus on the production line. She would let out a short laugh and walk away, seeming displeased. A few weeks passed. The environment resumed an almost normal rhythm, although Matthew's death was still felt by everyone. At home, my life had changed considerably. My salary had increased. I managed to put a down payment on a used car after much research, and even helped my mother move to a better place. I felt I was entering a phase of achievements. It was during this period that Fiona began to approach me in another way. She would appear in my office with irrelevant questions about orders or about the electronic clock, asking me to accompany her to the cutting station to evaluate supposed problems. I found it strange, because she had been working there long enough to master those procedures. I remember one afternoon, when almost everyone had gone to lunch. Fiona entered my room with a clipboard and closed the door. "Anthony, I have a problem here on the requisition form. Can you take a look?" She sat close to me, leaning more than necessary, almost touching my arm. I felt the subtle but striking perfume. When I took the sheet, I realized there was no real error, just a poorly filled header. I commented that it was easy to correct in the system, but she remained by my side, pretending to be interested in every detail on the computer screen. When I realized it, we were very close, and she was staring at me without blinking. At first, I tried to maintain a professional posture, but the tension was clear. I had heard rumors about her and Matthew, but the proximity caused me a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Then Fiona put the clipboard on the table. "You're working too hard. Why don't you take a break?" she said, smiling from the corner of her mouth. It was so sudden that it caught me off guard. My heart accelerated. I replied that I needed to finish some reports, but she insisted, arguing that I had the right to a few minutes off. Before I could refuse, she was already at the door, beckoning me with a gesture. I followed her to a warehouse in the back of the factory, where we kept spare cardboard sheets. It was a place seldom frequented during the day. Inside, the smell of paper and dust was strong. She leaned against the wall and called me over. I hesitated, but approached to understand what she wanted. Instead of speaking, Fiona pulled me by the shirt and kissed me. I was confused, as I always avoided mixing work and personal life, especially with someone surrounded by rumors. However, at the same time, I was overtaken by a desire that frightened me. We tried to be quick so as not to be caught. Before I knew it, we were holding each other in embraces, almost like two teenagers. After a few minutes, she fixed her hair, smiled as if nothing had happened, and returned to the production line. I stayed leaning on the pile of cardboard, feeling a mixture of euphoria and guilt. In the following days, these furtive encounters were repeated, increasingly. Sometimes it was in my car during an extended lunch hour, other times in discreet corners of the warehouse. I felt an uncontrollable desire when near her, and that scared me. It seemed like I didn't have full command of my decisions. The news spread quickly in the factory, of course. As much as we tried to be discreet, the atmosphere between us was evident. People looked at me with an air of caution, as if not to end up like Matthew. But I was so involved that I ignored the warnings. My mother noticed that I was different, coming home late and spending more money. She asked if I was seeing someone. I disguised it, but she intuited it was something serious. It was then that Fiona invited me to her house on a Saturday. She casually said at the end of the workday, "My children will love to meet you. They have a lot of energy. Come spend the day with us." Until then, I only knew she had 3 children, each by a different father, according to rumors. I wasn't sure if I wanted to get involved to the point of dealing with children, but the desire to be by her side spoke louder. On Saturday, I took my car and drove to the address she provided, without worrying about the travel time. Upon arrival, I found the place strange. It was a simple yet organized residential area, with thin-walled, semi-detached houses. Fiona received me at the door with a broad smile, wearing a light fabric dress. When I entered, I saw toys scattered in the living room and 3 children. One about 9 years old, another 6, and the youngest 4. They looked at me suspiciously at first, but then relaxed when Fiona reassured them, saying I was her friend. We spent the afternoon eating pizza and watching cartoons. She treated me as if we had been intimate for a long time. She even commented that the oldest daughter attended the neighborhood school. The middle one stayed full-time at daycare, and a neighbor helped her take care of the youngest when she worked overtime. I had fun, but still felt like a stranger in that dynamic. At the end of the afternoon, Fiona pulled me to her bedroom. She said the children were playing and wouldn't disturb us. Once again, we got involved. I left there dazed, divided between fascination and the discomfort of entering her life so quickly. Upon returning home, I couldn't sleep properly. It seemed like I was entangled in something that was sucking me in. I started spending more money on outings, paying for dinners for Fiona and her children, buying presents for everyone. She said she needed financial help with the bills. My salary had gone up, but I also had car payments, expenses for the apartment I was setting up, and other obligations. I ended up in debt. My sister Thea noticed my strange behavior. One day, she called me for coffee. "You're different, Anthony. It seems like you don't think about anything other than this woman." "Mom is worried." I replied that she shouldn't interfere. I said I was in love and wanted a new life with Fiona. Thea looked at me worriedly and told me that her colleagues had more impressions about my girlfriend. I got irritated, told her to mind her own business. She fell silent, but continued insisting that I should distance myself. 2 months passed. I was practically living with Fiona and the children. I took my television, my video game console, some furniture. She even freed up space in the closet for my clothes. Curiously, sometimes she would disappear at night, claiming to visit a friend and return in the early morning. I would ask, but she would change the subject. I avoided insisting to avoid arguing. My worried family decided to intervene. A distant cousin who rarely spoke to me showed up at my door with some friends. They said they needed to talk, and against my will, they took me to see a lady known in the neighborhood for her spiritual gifts. I found it all absurd. I tried to refuse, but they were firm, saying they were worried about my health. Arriving there, the lady analyzed my hands, asked me to say a small prayer, and then threw a handful of herbs into a basin of water where I should pour my urine. At first, I refused, thinking it was a ridiculous ritual, but my relatives insisted. To end it, I obeyed. Something strange happened. When I put in the urine, foam emerged with a strong, unpleasant odor, and the healer shook her head in disapproval. "There's a heavy energy here. He's been bound." I didn't believe it, but the certainty of everyone there shook me. She asked me to kneel and began to pass rue and other plants over my body, blowing smoke from burnt herbs. I felt nauseous and suddenly vomited on the floor right in front of everyone. The smell was horrible, and I noticed some repulsive things in the mass, like balls of hair. I was so sick that I could barely open my eyes. My sister and cousin reacted as if that confirmed everything. I remained skeptical, but was scared by the scene. The healer advised that I not see Fiona for a few days, as the effect could still harm me. They took me to my mother's house and locked me in for a night without allowing me to leave. After the shock, they even considered taking me to a health clinic, but I said I felt better and opposed it. I got my cell phone back and saw dozens of messages from Fiona, indignant and asking where I was. The next day, I went to work. I felt my stomach churning all the time. I tried to avoid Fiona, but she followed me to the office. "Why didn't you sleep at home? Did something happen?" I lied that I had a family emergency. She looked at me with suspicion. Later, I pretended I needed to sort out documents downtown, but went straight to my old apartment, of which I still had the key. I entered and collapsed on the couch, trying to understand what was happening. For the first time in a long time, I felt my head freer, as if I were escaping from a trance. I remembered Matthew dead, and how he had also changed radically in the last weeks of his life. I decided to end everything with Fiona. I didn't know if there was really something supernatural, or if it was just a destructive relationship, but it wasn't good for me. For a few days, I went to work and maintained minimal contact with her. When she appeared, I said I was very busy or showed myself cold. It wasn't easy because I still felt the urge to seek her out, but I remained firm. It was then that everything completely fell apart. One afternoon, Fiona left the factory early, claiming she felt unwell. At night, I received a call from one of her neighbors, saying that Fiona was very sick and calling for me. A sense of guilt invaded me, so I ran over there. Upon entering, I saw the house in disarray. The children crying in a corner and Fiona lying on the couch, sweating, with disheveled hair and pale skin. "I don't know what you did," she mumbled, almost without strength. "Calm down, let's call for help," I tried to help her. When I raised her a little, she vomited. The odor was the worst I had ever smelled. It seemed like there was something inside that shouldn't be there. The children were screaming desperately. I took my cell phone to call an ambulance, but there was no signal inside the house. I ran out and asked a passing motorcycle taxi to call for help at the nearest health post. I returned and found Fiona unconscious, breathing with difficulty. Her body was relaxing until it was motionless, her eyes half closed. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, but she was no longer responding. The paramedics avoided questions at that moment and just took her away urgently. I stayed in the house trying to calm the children until someone from her family appeared. The next morning, I received news that Fiona had not survived at the hospital. They only said that the death appeared to be related to an infection, but further tests would be necessary. I was in shock, feeling guilty and confused. The children were taken by an aunt who suddenly appeared. I had no legal bond to interfere, so I could only say goodbye to them, wishing them well. At the factory, the story spread like wildfire. Some said she was cursed, that the fate of the men she got involved with was always tragic. Others lamented, saying it was sad to see someone young die and leave 3 children behind. For me, nothing seemed real. I continued processing what had happened, the sudden promotion, the intense involvement, the forced distancing, and finally her strange death. Mr. Lawson called me to his office again, concerned about my state. He granted me a few days of leave to recover. I accepted, but was afraid to be alone. I went to my apartment and spent days without leaving, just eating what was in the refrigerator and exchanging messages with my sister. She insisted that I go again to the healer or to a doctor, but I had no strength for anything. Upon returning, the climate in the factory was different. Some employees resigned, citing fear of bad energies. Others began to attend religious services, seeking protection. And I continued taking care of my responsibilities as a supervisor, trying to focus on what was measurable and controllable so as not to go crazy. Months later, I gradually reconnected with my family. I told everyone sincerely what I had experienced with Fiona. I'm not sure if I was really bewitched, or if it was just neediness and intense seduction. My mother and sister supported me, saying that the important thing was that I was free. My cousin, the one who took me to the healer, says that this kind of thing doesn't have a simple explanation. Over time, I met someone else in a night course on industrial management. We started dating without haste, valuing a healthier relationship with companionship and without manipulation. Sometimes I remember what I experienced with Fiona and wonder if I could have done something to prevent her death or Matthew's. But I don't find definitive answers. Today, I carry on my routine without feeding great ghosts. I realize that no matter how much one tries to explain everything logically, certain experiences remain in a threshold between the real and the incomprehensible. Perhaps there is no concrete evidence of something supernatural, but the sensation of having been dominated by an uncontrollable desire still serves as a warning for me never to ignore signs that something is wrong again. I hope my story serves to alert other people not to blindly dive into situations that seem too good to be true. Sometimes a new feeling emerges and erases everything else, but it's necessary to keep one foot in reality. If I learned anything, it's that true companionship isn't built on the basis of manipulation or desperation. I continue working at the factory, now with clearer goals for the future. I intend to save enough to open a small business and perhaps form a family in a solid way. The memory of Fiona doesn't easily fade, but each day the weight diminishes. Still, I carry the caution of someone who almost lost himself in a passion wrapped in shadows. Good evening. My name is Jonah, and for many years I worked as a night watchman at a small antique gallery situated in the heart of New Orleans. The gallery, called Timeless Treasures, was known for its peculiar collection of antique pieces, including an impressive number of vintage mannequins. I always considered mannequins to be nothing more than plastic sculptures. However, on one specific night, this view changed completely. In the beginning, my night shifts were quite peaceful. The gallery remained closed and shrouded in half-light, and my company was limited to the ancient objects, clothes, paintings, vases, and of course, the always motionless mannequins arranged on shelves and throughout the main hall. Some wore clothes, while others were simply exhibited as is. At first, I even enjoyed the solitude and serenity that the early morning hours provided. But this calmness was interrupted after the arrival of a new shipment of merchandise. One night upon arriving for my shift, I was greeted by Alina, the gallery's owner, who displayed her usual animated smile, a clear sign that she had something new to show me. She pointed to a large crate in the center of the hall and enthusiastically told me she had received very old mannequins that would certainly catch the attention of customers. As soon as I looked at the box, a shiver ran down my spine. The new mannequins were wrapped in transparent plastic, but their forms were already unsettling, faceless heads, completely smooth and without details. As I unpacked them and positioned them on their pedestals, I felt something strange, an icy sensation, almost as if I were being watched. Even without eyes or expressions, the mannequins seemed to follow my every movement. Although uncomfortable, I did my best to ignore the sensation and continued with my tasks. The first hours of the night passed without major incidents. I checked the door locks, inspected the security system, and ensured everything was in order. However, those featureless mannequins seemed to project their presence into the environment. When the clock struck 4:31 in the morning, something truly frightening happened. At first, I heard low noises that resembled muffled murmurs. I thought it was my imagination or some sound coming from outside. But gradually, the sounds became clearer and more disturbing, almost like voices conversing in a low tone. Against what my instinct shouted, I decided to investigate. With hesitant steps, I approached the mannequins, trying to identify the source of the noises. My hands trembled as I advanced. It was then that I realized something was out of place. Some mannequins were no longer in their original positions. One, previously erect, now leaned slightly as if trying to reach something. Another seemed to have turned its head at a subtly different angle. The environment was filled with whispers, unintelligible words that seemed to come from the mannequins themselves. It was as if they were communicating in an impossible to understand language. I felt cornered in a nightmare, fear squeezing my chest as I tried to comprehend what was happening. Despite knowing those objects were inanimate, what I was witnessing defied all logic. Mannequins shouldn't talk, let alone move. But on that early morning, reality seemed to have bent to the shadows and the inexplicable. Suddenly, I heard a sound that resembled a sigh coming from one of the mannequins. It was as if it were breathing. I stood static, overcome by terror as I watched its shoulders rise and fall in a disturbing rhythm. It made no sense. It was impossible for that to be happening. Then, to my utter despair, one of the mannequins took a small step in my direction. The movement, though discreet, was enough to make my heart race. Instinctively, I backed away, but couldn't take my eyes off that empty face that seemed to stare at me. The terror I felt made me run to the surveillance station, seeking a sense of security. At least, that's what I hoped to find there. I sat in front of the camera screens, trying to calm myself, although my hands still trembled and my breathing was irregular. I looked attentively at the monitors, hoping for some sign that what I had witnessed was real. But in the images, the mannequins were exactly where Alina and I had left them. Simple, immobile figures, wrapped in darkness. Still, the atmosphere in the gallery was suffocating. I couldn't take my eyes off the cameras, anxiously awaiting any movement, but the screens showed only silence and immobility. I took a deep breath, trying to regain my composure, and got up, feeling my legs still heavy with fear. I walked toward the door, casting cautious glances at the mannequins, while murmuring to myself that it was all just a trick of my mind. When I was about to touch the doorknob, a loud creak echoed through the gallery. I immediately turned my face toward the sound and saw one of the mannequins collapse to the floor, producing a dry, loud noise. I felt a chill run through my body and stood motionless, overcome by shock. There was no one in the gallery besides me, and yet the mannequin had fallen on its own. I decided to face the situation and approached with slow steps, my heart racing. I picked up the fallen mannequin. It was ice cold to the touch, as if it had just been removed from a freezer. I placed it back on its pedestal, but what I saw next increased my discomfort even more. The mannequins were not only in different positions, but also appeared more detailed. Despite still being faceless, their bodies presented a strange resemblance to reality. There were contours of veins and muscles under the pale, smooth surface. I tried to find a logical explanation for all of it. Perhaps fatigue was affecting my perception, or maybe Alina had reorganized the mannequins before leaving, and I simply hadn't noticed. After all, she had been near them while we unloaded the new merchandise. With these thoughts, I returned to the surveillance station. There I fixed my attention on the cameras again, determined to find some proof that what I had experienced wasn't a product of my imagination. Minutes passed, then hours, and nothing moved on the screens. The mannequins remained still, static in their places. The clock advanced in an excruciating manner, marking each second. I felt trapped in a cycle of uncertainty and fear, questioning if everything I had experienced was real, or just a manifestation of my mental state. Finally, after a long internal battle, I decided to face the facts. Maybe the mannequins had never actually moved, and it was all just an illusion caused by fatigue. I couldn't share my experience with anyone. I feared they would judge me incapable of handling the job. The following night, I returned to my post, determined to believe that the previous episode had been the result of mental exhaustion. Still, a persistent uneasiness haunted me. From time to time, my eyes fell on the security camera images that showed the mannequins. Part of me wanted them to move, even if just a little, to confirm what I had seen. However, every time I observed them, I felt a growing fear that at some point they would turn to directly face the lens. My mind oscillated between the rational and the inexplicable, struggling to find some balance as the hours passed. Fatigue began to weigh on me. The experience from the previous night had deprived me of rest during the day, and now I was fighting against sleep. My eyes could hardly remain fixed on the screens. Then, as if it were a cruel repetition, the clock marked 4:31 again, that fateful hour. A chill ran through my body as I, unable to avoid it, fixed my gaze on the camera pointed at the mannequins. That's when the whispers recommenced. They were as light as they were disturbing, filling the gallery with a strange and somber sound. The incomprehensible words had something supernatural about them, as if the mannequins were sharing obscure secrets among themselves. Fear settled in me, and my heart accelerated upon noticing something terrible. One of the mannequins was no longer in place. My lungs seemed incapable of absorbing air, as the reality of that absence hit me. Seeing a mannequin disappear was somehow more frightening than seeing it move. What made everything even more disturbing was that the other mannequins seemed to have turned their heads, now facing the camera. Despite their smooth faces, it was as if they were staring directly at me. That vision was surreal and profoundly terrifying. Driven by pure survival instinct, I began to frantically alternate between cameras, trying to locate the disappeared mannequin. I reviewed each image several times, but there was no sign of it. It was as if it had completely vanished. On the fourth attempt at analysis, something caught my attention. In the corner of one of the screens, I glimpsed a humanoid figure that quickly disappeared behind a group of hanging dresses. It was an indistinct shadow, but enough to make me believe I wasn't alone in the gallery. My mind raced, exploring each possibility. It could be an intruder, someone who had managed to enter undetected and was playing tricks on me, maybe even responsible for the disappearance of the mannequin. The idea was frightening, but it also gave me courage to act. If there was indeed someone there, it was my duty to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight that was on the table and, with hesitant steps, walked toward the corner where I had seen that shadow. The silence inside the gallery was suffocating, broken only by my accelerated breathing. Each step I took made the wooden floor creak, amplifying the sensation that something or someone might be watching me. When I finally reached the corner, the flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating piles of antique dresses and clothes that belonged to the mannequins. However, there was no sign of any intruder or the disappeared mannequin. I stood there, feeling a mixture of confusion and dread. Had it just been my mind playing tricks? Perhaps exhaustion and fear were distorting reality, creating images that never existed. Despite my hesitation, I resolved to investigate the rest of the gallery in search of some clue. I traversed each corridor, examined shelves and hidden corners, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Everything seemed to be exactly as it should be, except for the mannequin that continued to be missing. There was something terrifying about the idea that it had simply vanished, and fear prevented me from approaching again the place where the other mannequins were. It was as if my own mind were conspiring to keep me away. After a long moment fighting against my paralysis, I decided to explore other parts of the gallery. I searched every remaining corner, trying to find some sign that I wasn't alone, but nothing appeared. I didn't know for sure if I should feel relieved by the apparent absence of an intruder, or even more uneasy about the mystery surrounding the disappearance of the mannequin. Finally, I returned to my surveillance post, wishing only that the night would end. However, as I walked back, passing by the place where I had seen the humanoid shadow, I heard something that made my heart race. It was a low whisper, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to freeze my blood. The sensation that someone was trying to get my attention was unmistakable. I quickly turned around, pointing the flashlight toward a nearby mannequin. It remained immobile in a typical pose, exactly as one would expect from a mannequin. For a brief instant, I felt relief. Maybe it was all a product of my imagination. Maybe nothing was really happening. But this thought didn't last long. Crushed by the oppressive darkness and the persistent whispers that seemed to echo in my mind. For some reason that I still don't understand to this day, I decided to approach that mannequin. As I got closer, I noticed something even more disturbing. Its appearance had changed. There was something new in the texture of its faceless skin. Under the smooth surface, the contours of veins and muscles were now visible, as if that inanimate object were beginning to acquire traits of a living being. My breathing became irregular as I approached. When I finally got close enough, I saw something that made me freeze. The mannequin's chest seemed to be moving, rising and falling in a grotesque replica of human breathing. Hesitantly, I extended my trembling hand to touch it, trying to find some vestige of logic in it all. As soon as my fingers touched its shoulder, a cutting cold traversed my body. Its surface was cold and moist, resembling the dead skin of a corpse. It was at that moment that the impossible happened. The mannequin's head slowly turned until it was facing directly at me. Horror took over my mind as the mannequin began to move its arms, first one, then the other. Its movements were strange, rigid, almost as if it were fighting against some invisible force that kept it trapped. I stumbled backward, my heart racing and my mind plunged into a chaos of terror. Each step back I took seemed to invite the mannequin to advance, its movements defying any notion of reality. It was as if it were moved by something beyond logic, and that only intensified my panic. Not quite sure how, my legs carried me running to the surveillance post. As soon as I entered, I locked the door with a quick, desperate movement. My eyes sought the security cameras, looking for answers, but the screens were full of interference. Static and flashes of light obscured any vision, leaving me completely blind to what was happening out there. As I tried to regulate my breathing and understand what had just happened, the sound of knocking began on the post's door. They were strong, insistent blows, as if someone or something were trying to enter. With each blow, the panic intensified. The door trembled under the force of the assaults, and I knew it wasn't something human that was on the other side. The knocks became more frantic, almost crazed, while the familiar whispers returned to echo. Incomprehensible words spoken in a low and disturbing tone traversed the wooden door like a somber echo. I felt paralyzed, but my survival instinct forced me to act. My trembling hands picked up a flashlight and a piece of metal that were on the table, the only things I could use as defense. I tried to look at the cameras one more time, but the images remained unusable. I was alone in a bubble of fear, trapped in a small space, surrounded by an invisible enemy. The incessant sound of the door being beaten and the murmurs only increased my sense of powerlessness. The hours seemed to drag on at an unbearable pace. The clock slowly advanced, marking each second like a sentence, while the siege at the door continued. Finally, the sound ceased. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the knocks. I didn't dare make any movement. I remained immobile and in complete silence, trapped in the surveillance post, with the interference on the cameras preventing any idea of what was happening out there. It was as if I were isolated in a bubble of darkness and fear, not knowing if what was on the other side had left or was just patiently waiting. With the arrival of morning, I heard a voice that seemed both distant and familiar. Alina, my boss, was calling me from outside. As much as I knew it was her, terror still kept me trapped, unable to open the door. Finally, she brought a locksmith to force the opening, since I remained paralyzed, without the courage to move or even respond. When they finally managed to unlock the door and investigated the gallery, they found nothing out of place. The mannequins were exactly where they should be, immobile in their habitual poses, seeming to mock me, as if they knew the terror they had caused. The apparent normality of the scene only made everything more disturbing. After that night, I couldn't continue in the job. The idea of returning to that place was unbearable. I submitted my resignation, aware that I would never have peace if I had to face again the shadows, the whispers, and the faceless mannequins that had indelibly marked my mind. I tried to move on, but the memories of that experience constantly haunt me. They appear in nightmares and emerge in the most unexpected moments, hidden in the darkest corners of my mind. I know what I experienced was real, but I also know that few believe my story. Despite everything, that gallery remains in my memory as a place shrouded in mystery and horror. I will never set foot there again. It's a space I will forever keep as a nightmare I would prefer to forget, but which refuses to disappear. 3 years later, I learned that the gallery had changed owners and been transformed into a cafe. All the mannequins were sold in a large liquidation. Sometimes I wonder if their new owners experienced anything similar, if they also heard the whispers in the dead of night. I read in the local newspaper that Alina had passed away 6 months after I left. The article mentioned she died peacefully in her sleep, but there was something in the description, the position in which they found her body, arms rigidly at her sides, eyes wide open staring at the ceiling, that sent chills down my spine. The new gallery owners renovated the entire place, tore down walls, and installed large windows to let natural light in. Perhaps they, too, sensed something wasn't right with the shadows that accumulated in the corners. I've moved to another state now, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that place. I work days at a hardware store, and I make sure to always leave before sunset. I keep a light on in my apartment at all times. Never complete darkness, never complete silence. Because in silence and darkness, I sometimes hear them again, the whispers, the slight movement of things that should remain still, the sensation of being watched by eyeless faces. Many have told me it was all in my head, a manifestation of stress, or perhaps an undiagnosed condition. Doctors have suggested medication for anxiety and sleep disorders, but none of them were there that night at 4:31 in the morning, when the mannequins decided it was time to move. Recently, I received a small package in the mail. There was no return address, just my name written in elegant handwriting. Inside was a small, faceless doll, with limbs that were unnaturally jointed, almost like a miniature mannequin. There was no note, no explanation. I burned it immediately in my backyard grill and scattered the ashes in a flowing river miles from my home. I changed my phone number and email the next day. But still, sometimes, just as I'm falling asleep, I hear it, a low whisper, almost imperceptible, coming from the darkest corner of my room. And though I keep telling myself it's just the wind, or the building settling, or neighbors talking through the wall, part of me knows better. Because once you've heard them speak, you never forget the sound. And once they know you can hear them, they never stop trying to reach you. It's curious how throughout life some friendships come and others go. But what's truly not amusing is the way certain friendships come to an end. A few years ago, my best friend Daisy decided to have her bachelorette party in Nashville, Tennessee. The idea of spending an entire weekend in this vibrant city was exciting, to say the least. Our group consisted of 7 women, including the bride. We all chipped in and rented an incredible house just minutes away from the bustling nightlife. A trip to Nashville isn't something simple for us, so careful planning was necessary to make this event special for Daisy. During the month we spent organizing everything. I became quite close with some of the women who would be at the wedding. One of them was, let's say, quite expansive to be gentle. But realistically, she was somewhat intense and occasionally invasive. Nevertheless, I ended up becoming quite close to her. Her name was Natalie, and our contact began with casual meetings over drinks to discuss trip details, but soon evolved into more frequent encounters and conversations that went beyond Daisy's wedding. Natalie was a restless soul. When we went out drinking, she was the type who didn't hesitate to climb onto the bar counter to dance. She always ended the night with someone, and seemed ready for more the next day, without losing her rhythm. For a while, I admired her free spirit and fearless attitude toward life. I was excited to enjoy Nashville alongside her, certain it would be a fun experience. But oh, how wrong I was. When the day of the trip finally arrived, I was already feeling a bit apprehensive about Natalie. As terrible as it sounds, the person I had considered an acquaintance, and then a friend now, began to awaken a certain insecurity in me. When we arrived in Nashville, I had to admit that my instinct wasn't wrong. Natalie was completely out of control, and not in a fun way. She climbed onto the bar counter to dance, as she had done so many times in our city, but ended up slipping and falling on her head. Fortunately, she didn't seem hurt, but it was an embarrassing scene, and we were asked to leave the establishment. Then she tried to provoke fights with both some of the bridesmaids and with strangers in the various bars we visited. Daisy became so uncomfortable that she suggested we return to the rented house and stay there to avoid more trouble. Natalie didn't like that idea at all and repeatedly insisted that we were there to party. If we wanted to stay home, we should have stayed in our city. As a bridesmaid, I tried to explain that the night was about what Daisy wanted, not what we wanted, but Natalie didn't seem to care. She basically called us boring and said she would continue the party at the bar. Daisy told us to leave her there and go back to the house. I warned Natalie to call me when she needed a ride, promising that one way or another, I would get her back to the house safely. She just shrugged, nodded, and went back to the bar. We, on the other hand, enjoyed the night playing board games and drinking at the rented house. Believe it or not, this was one of the most pleasant moments of the entire trip. It was light fun, and we all laughed a lot. I had completely forgotten about Natalie until around 4 a.m, when I woke up and checked my phone. There was a message from her sent at 2:30, a photo where she, along with 3 other girls and a guy, was showing the middle finger to the camera, all with the same defiant gesture. It might seem like a concerning message to some, but I can assure you that for Natalie, this was quite typical. I tried calling her, but the call went straight to voicemail. I sent several messages, but received no response. I walked around the house to make sure she wasn't sleeping in any of the rooms, and to my surprise, I couldn't find her. I wasn't sure what to do. By around 6 a.m, I woke up some of the other girls to find out what they thought we should do given Natalie's behavior the previous night. Most suggested we leave her be, and that it served her right. Although part of me understood that sentiment, we knew we couldn't leave her like that. After all, something could have happened, and in the end, she was still Daisy's friend. When Daisy woke up, there was still no sign of Natalie. Daisy, who tends to be anxious, panicked almost immediately. Our flight was later that same day, and we needed to prepare to go to the airport. After much debate, we decided the best option would be to call the police to find out how to proceed. Before we made that final decision, Natalie called us. She sounded confused, as if she were still under the influence of alcohol. She yelled at all of us, calling us terrible friends and saying we didn't deserve her. She specifically called me out, which to this day I still don't quite understand. We asked her to come back to the airport because we needed to leave, but she simply told us to get lost, saying she would return home on her own. As she ended her series of insults, her last words were literally, "Leave me in Nashville." Goodbye. Daisy spent the afternoon trying to convince Natalie to go to the airport, but to no avail. Natalie turned off her location and blocked all of us, and we had no idea where she was. In the end, we boarded the plane and left her in Nashville. Days passed, and I went on with my life without thinking much about Natalie. Eventually, I talked to Daisy about it, and she told me she hadn't heard from her either. Since Natalie didn't have family nearby, we didn't know who to turn to ensure she was okay. We searched for information online, but nothing came up. We even checked missing persons lists and obituaries, but with no results. In the end, we concluded that wherever Natalie was, she didn't want to be found, and we just hoped she was safe. This happened years ago, But it was just last week that I had my first re-encounter with Natalie, and it wasn't pleasant at all. On Friday, after a long day at work, I arrived home determined to spend the night alone. The week had been exhausting, and all I wanted was to relax with a glass of wine. My boyfriend was traveling on business, so I would have the house to myself. It was past midnight when I decided to prepare for bed. I called my boyfriend to say goodnight, and while brushing my teeth, I made a video call with him. I propped the phone on a small cabinet in the bathroom, where he could see through the door and into my bedroom. My boyfriend was in the middle of a story when he suddenly stopped talking. I asked if everything was okay, and he replied, "Is there someone else there?" I laughed and picked up the phone, asking what he was talking about. He said he had seen the closet door open a little in the background. My heart raced, but I still thought he was trying to scare me. I looked back at the phone, and he seemed genuinely frightened, which is quite unusual for him. Then he sent me a message asking me to leave the apartment immediately, saying he was certain he had seen someone moving in the closet. I tried to stay calm as I went to the kitchen to put on my shoes. When I looked back at the bedroom, standing at the entrance was Natalie. Her gaze was insane, as if she were about to attack. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me fixedly. With a somber tone of voice, she muttered, "You left me in Nashville." I raised my hands, trying to calm the situation. Meanwhile, my boyfriend, still on the call, asked his roommates at the hotel to call the police and send help. Before I could speak, Natalie repeated, now with more anger in her voice, "You left me in Nashville." My survival instinct kicked in, and I ran as fast as I could toward the door. Natalie came right after me, shouting the same phrase over and over. I was running desperately, and she didn't give up the chase. Then the lights of a police car in the distance. I frantically waved to them, and Natalie showed no sign of stopping. One of the officers got out of the car, and at that moment, Natalie attacked me right in front of him. The officer immediately restrained her, and she began to scream uncontrollably, emitting confused and unintelligible sounds. When they searched Natalie, they found a knife hidden in her hoodie. What she intended to do with that knife, I don't know. I'm still processing all of this, which is so recent, and I'm not sure how to handle the situation. I've hired a lawyer, and am trying to understand what really happened. It's as if Natalie is just a shadow of who she once was. I feel that the person I knew has disappeared. I've never had a friend who entered and exited my life so intensely and unexpectedly. I think about everything that happened in Nashville and about how we reacted that night, and I'm sure that leaving Natalie behind ended up contributing to her downfall. I carry a weight of guilt for what happened, although many tell me not to do so. I sincerely hope she finds a path to recovery, and if anyone can guide me on what to do from here forward, I would deeply appreciate it. Just remember to be kind to everyone, because we never know what someone might be going through. When I was 12 years old, my family moved to a secluded house in Riverside County, California, near attractions like Knott's Berry Farm and Disneyland. This was in the early 90s. We lived there for approximately 1 year, and the house was undoubtedly a place filled with inexplicable events. Below are some of the most memorable occurrences. First, every night after everyone went to sleep, the sound of someone digging with a shovel would echo near the window. However, upon checking, there was no one there. If someone turned on the light, the noise would cease for brief moments, perhaps 30 seconds at most, before starting again. When we tried to investigate outside, the sound would disappear completely. We would go back inside, and after a few minutes, the digging sound would return. Second, as a child, I had obsessive-compulsive disorder and meticulously organized all my toys before going to bed. On some mornings, upon waking, I would find them scattered across the floor, as if someone had played with them during the night. I used to blame my younger siblings, but my mother reminded me that I was the last to go to bed and the first to get up, which made it unlikely that they were responsible. Third, exactly at 11 at night without fail, sounds of children screaming and playing would echo outside the upstairs window, as if they were in the backyard. Looking through the window, everything was shrouded in darkness, and there was no one there. You could also see the neighboring yards, equally deserted. One night, I paid attention to capture what the voices were saying, and discovered they were playing dodgeball. Shouts like "kick it, run, go" were clearly audible. This happened every night. On some occasions, I would go downstairs and open the door to try to hear better, but the sound would disappear. Curiously, it was only audible from upstairs. Fourth, once my grandmother spent the night in our house. She became so terrified that she decided never to return. She slept in the guest room upstairs and reported hearing sounds coming from outside the window. When she looked, she saw a shadow that seemed to walk toward the front door, but there was no one there, no source for that strange shadow. Fifth, my aunt also spent a night in the same room, and a similar event occurred. She heard sounds from outside, and peering through the window, spotted lights and shadows moving toward the entrance door with no sign of anyone nearby. Like my grandmother, she had difficulty explaining what she saw and heard, and never wanted to return for a visit. Sixth, the rent for the house was incredibly low compared to any other residence in the vicinity. Each time the owner came to collect the payment, she would ask if everything was okay, if anything strange had happened. That seemed unusual. When my parents invited her in, she always refused. Seventh, our neighbors to the right were peculiar. The couple was older. The man never uttered a single word, not even a hello, while the wife was talkative but repeated questions similar to those of the owner. "Is everything okay? Are you all right?" She seemed to have some knowledge about something that we ignored. Eighth, once we were playing with one of the neighborhood boys, running back and forth. We all ran back to my house, and as soon as we crossed the door, he stopped abruptly. "What's wrong?" we asked. He explained that his parents didn't allow him to enter our house. He had been forbidden. The reason: he had spent a night there with the children who lived in the house before us, about a year prior. That night the children's mother woke up screaming, grabbed her kids, and ran out of the house. As they ran, they all saw a blue mist, something like an apparition with a clearly delineated form of a head and shoulders. Ninth, the only person in my family who witnessed this blue figure was my father. He told us that he went downstairs and saw the form moving toward his closet. The description he gave was identical to that of our friend, who never wanted to enter the house again. 10th, on the last day we were in the house, after loading everything into the moving truck, we were organizing to leave and eating the last pieces of pizza as we prepared to go. My father said something like, "Finally, we're leaving this horrible house." There was a wall panel a little more than a meter from where he was, near the kitchen. Out of nowhere, the panel vibrated, detached from the wall, and hit him hard on the head. We all saw it happen right before our eyes. What I find most curious is that while we lived there, we hardly spoke about these events. Speaking for myself, I always thought I was imagining things, trying to find an explanation for what I saw and heard. My younger brother did the same. Take, for example, the sound of children playing outside the window at night, I thought. These kids have no sense, playing so late, and why every night? At the time, at 12 or 13 years old, I think I didn't have enough maturity to realize that something was indeed very wrong. Only after we moved did we begin to compare our experiences, and everyone's reaction was always, "You felt that too." My parents were the only ones who realized how strange the house was, but they never wanted to scare us, especially considering that our financial situation didn't allow us to leave immediately. Many other things happened, but these are undoubtedly the ones that stand out the most. We also got used to hearing doors slamming upstairs, and always wondered who was there, or if it was just the wind. When we went up to check, all the doors were open, but the sound of a door slamming was unmistakable. Our cat, normally calm and playful, had the habit of suddenly stopping on the stairs with fur bristling and a fixed gaze, letting out a frightening hiss. He always looked toward the top of the stairs while doing this. At the time, we thought the cat had some quirk. Years later, we realized he was probably seeing something beyond, especially because he never exhibited this behavior again after we left that house. My husband and I have always shared a genuine passion for cats. In fact, it's likely that neither of us would have even considered marrying someone who didn't share this appreciation for animals. For us, pets make all the difference in creating a welcoming and lively home environment. Don't you agree? A little before our wedding, many years ago, we decided to adopt 2 kitten siblings during a spontaneous visit to our local Animal Protection Association. They were only 5 weeks old and had already been there for a week, still too young to be separated from their mother. They were 2 small, trembling black and white kittens, a male and a female, huddled together and visibly frightened. We had no doubt it was inevitable that we would take both of them home. Because they were so tiny, they developed a deep bond with us, different from any other cat we had before or after. Astrid became inseparable from my husband, while Siegfried showed a special connection with me. This was evident from the beginning, and they were great friends, as is common among siblings who grow up together. Astrid, a short-haired cat, was bold as a lion, and although she wasn't always the most astute, she had surprising abilities considering she never received instructions from her mother. She was an excellent hunter and a fearless fighter, capable of even intimidating crows. Her brother, on the other hand, was a beautiful long-haired cat of large build, sensitive, and a bit shy despite his imposing manner. He was a frequent target of stray cats that tried to challenge him, and he would let out loud meows calling for Astrid, who would run to his rescue and chase away whoever it was. Siegfried, in his most peculiar characteristic, wouldn't even think of helping her. On the contrary, he would run to the door and frantically scratch, anxious to hide safely inside the house. Astrid ended up being one of the cats that cost us the most financially over the years. In the early days of our marriage, when our finances were tight, we accumulated countless credit card debts due to her problems and setbacks. We flew with Astrid to Portland for her to receive radiation treatments for her thyroid. There was a time when her liver almost stopped functioning, which left her hospitalized at the vet for a week. On another occasion, she broke all the bones in one of her paws after getting it stuck in a bench in the backyard. Astrid would frequently stop eating and become dangerously thin. My husband would then crush the dry food, make a paste-like mixture, and feed her with a syringe. Even with all the effort and high costs, we never regretted it, as Astrid always managed to recover, except in her last illness. She was incredibly stubborn and resilient, like a small, affectionate hurricane. Siegfried left us a few years before his sister, a victim of cancer, which was devastating. Astrid lived to be about 15 years old. Shortly before her departure, also due to cancer, we moved to a new house. We left a dark, cramped bungalow for a spacious, bright residence with huge windows, and to the delight of an arthritic little cat who loved to play with water, an open shower without a door. Astrid was enchanted with the new house, and we were happy that she had the chance to enjoy this space. Our backyard overlooked protected public lands, and when Astrid passed after her last trip to the vet, we buried her under a lush artemisia bush visible from the living room window. Given Astrid's tenacity, her peculiar personality, and her connection to the new home, we shouldn't have been so surprised when we realized that she had, in a way, returned. It all started with small glimpses from the corner of the eye, both for me and my husband, but we kept it to ourselves until the noises began to appear. They were typical Astrid sounds that manifested mainly at night when our other two kittens were nearby, sleeping with us in bed. The familiar sound of her head hitting the bottom of the coffee table, a table we'd had for years, and which Astrid never got used to rising from more carefully. The impact of her jumping from the dining table, the rustling of her paws rummaging through the trash bag in search of a snack, and the tinkling of a cat toy being pushed along the way. Then Astrid began to make visits to the bed. My husband clearly perceived her weight landing on the mattress and awkwardly walking over his legs. And no matter how much we observed, nothing physical was actually there. To make everything even more interesting, Moo, our rescued black and white cat, would greet her, raising his head in her direction and emitting a soft, friendly meow, a greeting in his sweet way. One of Astrid's habits in life was to squeeze between my head and my husband's, since after all, she was his little cat. She would push her backside against my sleeping face and settle in for a long session of kneading Daddy's neck with a constant purr as background sound. He would end up with a sore neck, and I would wake up with a mouth full of cat hair. So one night, during one of these spectral visits, I woke up to loud purring between us. The curious thing is that there was nothing there beyond the sound itself. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, that sensation where every sense seems to light up. But I thought to myself, it's just Astrid, she loves us and would never harm us. With that thought, I relaxed completely and went back to sleep. No big deal, really. Some nights, when the noises would start while my husband and I were reading in bed, we would exchange glances and start laughing. It's worth saying that my husband has always been a skeptic who barely tolerates discussions about the supernatural. Even so, he ended up accepting the situation, who also seemed to perceive something, fixing his eyes with great attention on the bedroom door while lying on the bed. Sometimes he would mutter something like a greeting to the invisible visitor, and soon go back to rest. Not everyone, however, dealt with Astrid's return so naturally. Our new kitten, Thunder, a Maine Coon full of energy, boldness, and noise, would frequently cast a wary look at the bedroom door, bristle, and run to hide between our pillows, leaving only his tail exposed. But then again, Thunder never got to know Astrid in life, as Moo had. Over time, I began to worry about the possibility that Astrid didn't realize she had passed away, and that perhaps she was upset that we were ignoring her presence. Out loud, I called to her and said that we loved her, but that now she needed to move on. A veterinarian told us that sometimes cats return after death in a new form to stay by our side. If that were the case, Astrid was certainly delaying that return, wandering around the house, and of course, hitting her head under the coffee table as always. I believe that she eventually understood the message. Astrid was stubborn and obstinate, but even she could catch a hint now and then. Eventually, her visits ceased. I've told Astrid's story to various people, and I notice that many are unsure if I'm being sincere. I have a reputation for having quite an ironic sense of humor, or if I'm simply out of touch with reality. However, I've read several accounts of similar experiences, which makes me believe that our experiences with Astrid are not so uncommon. In the end, it takes a really special cat to return in this way, no matter how much it loved its owners. To me, it's no surprise that Astrid managed to do this. Since I settled into this house back in late May, I've experienced strange situations, and I've already shared some of them before. One time, I received a visit from a skeptical friend and his wife, and I told him about some of the occurrences. We decided to explore the surroundings to see if we could capture any shadows or any strange signs. Directly across from my house stands a grain elevator which, despite appearing ordinary, has a somewhat sinister aura about it. My friend, whom I'll call Thomas, decided to go there alone around 10 o'clock at night on August 10th, 2022. Last night, as I write this. Meanwhile, his wife, my wife, and I were in the front garden chatting. A short time later, Thomas returned with a pale face and sweating. He recounted that he saw an incredibly long, thin hand with slender, elongated fingers emerging from the corner of the silo, about 8 or 10 feet high. He even directed his flashlight toward the spot, but the image disappeared. Thomas, who had never believed in supernatural phenomena or humanoid creatures, was visibly terrified, and we could see that he wasn't joking. Curiosity drove us forward, so Thomas and I went back there, and we both saw a head move quickly around the corner and heard footsteps that seemed to follow us. We felt gusts of cold air, as if the temperature dropped about 10 degrees Fahrenheit suddenly, which made us shiver all over. We walked for about 10 minutes along the train tracks, hearing sounds that made us repeatedly ask if the other was hearing them too. We then decided to call our wives to see if they noticed anything, but without mentioning what we had witnessed. When they arrived, both noticed points where the air seemed much colder, and they also got goosebumps. At one point, I had the distinct sensation of something lightly touching my hand. Later, while we were chatting again in the front garden, I told Thomas that what he saw resembled descriptions of a skinwalker or a wendigo. I showed him some drawings of these creatures, and he became visibly alarmed, saying that was exactly what he had seen. We decided to go to the location again, and he became even more frightened. He said he saw bright yellow eyes peering from a height of about 10 feet in the same area, where we had seen what appeared to be a head. For someone so skeptical, he was genuinely shaken, pale, and sweating with fear. I don't know what he saw or what we heard, but it didn't resemble any animal because the footsteps would stop as soon as we stopped too. Whatever Thomas saw must have been about 10 feet tall. We tried to reproduce what he saw of the hand, but none of us could reach such a high height just standing on the ground. With each step along the tracks, the sensation of dread and of being watched accompanied us, and we weren't under the influence of alcohol or any substance. We were all sober. I live in a region between 5 and 10 miles from an old battlefield, and a site where a Native American massacre occurred in the 18th century. Perhaps you've already heard about skinwalkers, figures from indigenous tradition who assume animal forms to cause harm. However, at the lake where I spent much of the summers of my childhood, these beings had a different name: Durians. Over time, their story was forgotten by many of the families who frequented the lake. But in mine, it is still told in whispers around the campfire. The legends of the Durians date back to the 18th century, when European settlers migrated northward to Wisconsin in search of profit in the fur trade. It was during this time that they discovered the lake, and around it they found native tribes. Most of these tribes were friendly and welcoming. Some were reserved, but most were cordial. Most, but not all. One particular tribe that lived in the swamps on the western side of the lake was feared. They attacked anyone who ventured through the swamp: men, women, children, other settlers, and even members of other tribes. No one knew for certain the reason for their aggressiveness, so the solution was to avoid contact. Over time, however, the attacks increased, resulting in deaths and disappearances, until the settlers reached their limit. They decided to counterattack, setting up ambushes and traps in the areas where the tribe usually was, on the trails, in hunting locations, and even in the village itself. But whenever they found these places, they were uninhabited, occupied only by a herd of white-tailed deer. From time to time, people who ventured into the swamp simply didn't return. They would disappear for days, until they were found completely torn apart. Most attributed these deaths to wolves, bears, or some large feline. But upon examining the area carefully, the only visible footprints were those of deer. However, this is not the main story. My story takes place centuries after the disappearances of the French settlers. I always considered the legends of the Durians just that, legends, tales to scare children and keep them safe within the limits of family properties. But one certain night, that view changed drastically. Bald eagles are common at the lake, but it's rare to find their nests. So when my cousin said he had seen a nest while kayaking down the river that cut through the swamp, my father and I naturally became curious. We climbed into the old, worn canoe, and with the little light that remained, we headed towards the swamp. As we approached, we spotted something strange. It was a doe drinking peacefully from the water. At first, she didn't notice our presence, but suddenly she raised her head and stared, which made me realize that something was wrong. White-tailed deer are common around there, but anyone who gets within about 100 feet of one ends up scaring the animal away. However, this doe was different. She remained motionless, and as we got closer, I could clearly see that something wasn't right. It seemed as if someone who had never seen a deer in their life tried to recreate one from a description. I got so close to the deer that I could almost touch it, but suddenly it simply turned, and with a strange walk almost like that of a puppet, entered the forest. My father and I exchanged glances, but ended up laughing at the situation. It must have been just a deformed deer, nothing more. We paddled down the river, and soon I was enveloped by a wave of intense sounds. Birds, crickets, and cicadas created a continuous melody around us. At the first curve, I heard something moving in the tall grass to the right, a heavy rustling. Perhaps it was that same unusual deer. My father didn't seem to notice, but I paid attention. There were more noises in the grass, and unexpectedly, I heard a soft whisper followed by a strange laugh, similar to that of a hyena, as the creature disappeared into the woods. A chill ran through me. It was as if invisible eyes were fixed on us. I wanted to speak to my father, but I feared he would just mock me, so we continued paddling in silence. After a while, we stopped to rest. We were looking at the tops of the trees, searching for any sign of eagle nests, when suddenly we noticed something strange. The swamp, previously so full of sounds, was completely silent. No bird songs, no crickets, no cicadas. And then I heard it again, a low whisper coming from the grass, this time from my right side. Another came from the left side, followed by laughter that echoed around us. It was no longer a sensation of being merely observed. I felt like prey. A sound of something splashing in the water behind me made me turn quickly. But when I looked, I saw only deer footprints in the muddy ground. I turned my gaze to my father, someone who never showed fear, and I noticed that he was terrified. We began to paddle with all our might, trying to escape from there, and the swamp awoke in chaos. We paddled against the current while birds dove at us. Insects formed clouds around us, and the macabre laughter surrounded us. They were minutes that seemed like hours, until suddenly the silence returned. We were finally in the open lake, away from the domains of the swamp and safe. I took the moment to breathe and try to calm down, until something made a soft sound as it fell into the water beside me. I looked and saw the tip of an arrow slowly descending to the shallow bottom of the bay. With a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, I turned to see where it might have come from, and at the edge of the swamp, I saw only a male deer. It walked awkwardly, like a marionette, until it disappeared from view among the shadows of the trees. Hello, I'd like to share a story that happened to me and some colleagues during catechism in my childhood. At the time, I was only 10 years old and one of the oldest in the group. Today, at 28, this memory is still as vivid as if it had occurred yesterday. Every time I recall this story, the same fear I felt at that time resurfaces, bringing back nightmares and the sensation of reliving those days. But anyway, this is my story. My mother would take me to catechism every Saturday at a small church in our town, which was quite close to home. Sometimes I would go with my classmates, who were also my neighbors. The church was situated at the end of our street, and behind it there was only a wooded area. Behind the church, I remember a small building that had once been a convent, but was deactivated at that time and always locked. The classes, which took place outdoors in front of the church, were a delight for us children, since we didn't like staying in enclosed environments. The classes were taught only by nuns. I began attending them with a friend who lived next door. Before the start, we always had to sing inside the church and say some prayers. Everything was going normally until something began to deeply disturb me. Behind the altar where the priest celebrated Mass, there was a door to the side, and I noticed a nun watching me in a cold manner. She was a woman with very pale skin and penetrating black eyes who didn't avert her gaze from me, which left me extremely uncomfortable. I mentioned this to my friend, who also saw her. He suggested that perhaps she was the Mother Superior because, in our innocence, we didn't fully understand the terms at the time. We thought she was just supervising to ensure that the other nuns fulfilled their duties. However, we agreed that there was something very imposing and frightening about that figure. The class ended, and we went to participate with our catechist, a young nun who was always in good spirits and loved to have us paint. While we were coloring, my friend called my attention to the building behind the church. There, next to the church, in front of the abandoned convent, was the nun watching us again. We knew it was the same person because we were close enough to recognize her pale face and her fixed, impressive gaze that sent shivers down to our bones. Especially for 10-year-old children, it was terrifying. I told my friend to avoid looking at her, hoping she would leave us alone since we were very afraid. So we went back to coloring, trying to ignore her presence. A few moments later, when I looked again, the nun was no longer there. We then had a 30-minute break for lunch, a period when we usually played soccer with our colleagues and other children from different groups. I was in the goal with my back to the church and the abandoned building, when suddenly one of the boys kicked the ball with great force, making it stop in the grounds of the building. Of course, as the goalkeeper, it fell to me to go get the ball. I was afraid, but I didn't want to show it or talk about it because I knew the other children might mock me, as is common. With great effort, I gathered my courage and began to walk in the direction where the ball had fallen. With each step, I moved further away from my colleagues who were drinking water. I walked slowly because the fear was paralyzing, and as much as I searched, I couldn't find the ball anywhere. I was already at the back of the church and could no longer see my friends, and they couldn't see me either. I continued the search, looking at the ground, when suddenly I had the idea to look up. It was then that something made me freeze, unable to move for a few seconds. In one of the windows of the abandoned building, there inside was the same terrifying nun with the pale face and penetrating black eyes. Upon seeing her, I became completely immobile, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do and was afraid to move, fearing she would follow me. Finally, I heard my friend's voice calling me, and when I turned, I saw that he was coming in my direction, asking where the ball was and why I was taking so long. He said that everyone was waiting and that the break was almost over. I didn't explain anything to him. I just said I couldn't find the ball and that I had been looking all over for it. He then offered to help me, but even with our search, we never found it. Deep down, I knew we wouldn't find it. After that, we went back and told the others what had happened with the ball. The boy who owned it was upset with the friend who had kicked it far away and asked for help to find it because he feared his mother's reprimand if he returned home without it. However, the church bell rang, signaling the end of the break, and we all had to return to class. The lady responsible for cleaning the church saw us on the grounds of the building and asked what we were doing there, since we didn't have permission to be in that place. We told her about the ball, and she replied that we would probably never find it, but asked us to leave there immediately because it wasn't allowed to be there. It didn't occur to us to ask why she thought we would never find the ball, but we obeyed and moved away. The next day, I went to Mass with my mother at the same church. During the celebration, all the nuns were seated on the benches beside the altar where the priest officiated. But once again, I saw that frightening nun behind the altar, standing at the same door. She watched me in a disturbing manner, as if she knew I was the only one capable of perceiving her presence. When I told this to my mother, she looked, but the nun had already disappeared. My mother just reprimanded me for talking during Mass. After Mass, as usual, there were food stalls set up by the church to raise funds. I always met my colleagues there while our mothers bought something. It was in this environment that we began to exchange experiences. An older boy asked if anyone had seen a nun who used to watch us from the abandoned building. Many confirmed that yes, they had, and confessed that they were very afraid of her, although they didn't know who she was. I was surprised because I thought only we had seen her, but apparently that wasn't the case. This same boy suggested that we all go to the church that afternoon to look for the ball and investigate what was inside the building. Everyone agreed as if it were a great adventure. However, only I, my friend, the owner of the ball, and his older brother went. The others, being very young, were not authorized to leave home. It was around 6 in the evening, and my mother allowed me to stay out until 8, the time when we always returned home. The church was closed, and there was no one around. The day was cloudy and threatened to rain, which made the environment even more frightening. We were 4 children walking to the building. The older boy suggested that we split into pairs. They would look for the ball behind the building, and we would look in front. Reluctantly, we agreed, and my friend and I began to walk through the grounds. Suddenly, we heard the other 2 screaming, and we ran to see what was happening. They had seen the nun again, watching them from the corner of the building. One of the boys said she smiled at them, but her teeth were sharp and dirty, as he described. Frightened, he declared that he preferred to go without the ball and leave, that he no longer cared. We were also about to leave, because there didn't seem to be any more reason to stay there. However, the older boy challenged us to continue and try to enter the building, to find out who that woman was. Of course, I was terrified, but I didn't want him to tell our other colleagues that we were afraid. So we agreed to stay. The doors of the building were locked, and the windows had bars. We tried to force the doors, but without success. The day was darkening rapidly, and the atmosphere was becoming increasingly terrifying. We tried a few more times, but couldn't get in. It was then that we heard footsteps on dry leaves beside the building, near a large tree. We fell silent, trying to listen. Suddenly, besides the footsteps, we heard a lament, a feminine lament that made every hair on our body stand on end. Perhaps you wonder if we ran away, but no. Instead, we slowly approached, curious, And it was then that we saw the scene that would traumatize us for years and would make me beg my mother never to take me to that church again. Hanging from that enormous tree was the same woman with a rope around her neck, but she was smiling at us. On the ground was the ball we had been searching for so much. The older boy immediately ran away crying, and my friend and I were paralyzed with shock, unable to move, until finally he pulled me and said to run and not stop. We fled from there as fast as possible. I arrived home, but I'm not sure exactly when, because it seemed I had completely lost my sense of time and reality. I was stunned, still processing everything we had witnessed. My friend didn't say goodbye. He simply went into his house, and I did the same. My mother just told me to take a bath and have dinner. However, I remember that night I couldn't eat anything. I just cried, asking her not to take me to that church anymore. However, she didn't understand why, believing the children hadn't done anything wrong. I insisted that I was afraid of the nun, but she never listened to me. So the following Saturday, there I was again at the church. My friend was also there, though during the week I hadn't seen him because he didn't leave the house. The other boy didn't show up, and the owner of the ball, who was younger than us, came accompanied by his older brother. Time passed, and we finally had our first communion. After that, I never returned to that church because we moved to a larger house. But life has its ironies. When I entered university, I reconnected with my childhood friend, the same neighbor with whom I shared that terrifying moment many years ago. In one of our conversations, the subject ended up falling on that event. Just like me, he still had nightmares about the nun and thought he was the only one who remembered it. I told him I couldn't forget either, and that the memory of that cold, evil face of that nun still frightened me very much. He agreed and told me that his younger sister, who also attended catechism at the same church, used to see a nun who watched her from the abandoned building. She and her friends would comment that the nun whispered to them from inside a locked room, asking them to open the door. But when they looked through the windows, they saw no one. His sister always believed it was the same nun we saw, and something very sinister was happening there. The story he heard said that a woman named Sophia had been forced to enter the convent by her parents, who didn't want her. Sophia never wanted to be a nun, but having nowhere else to go, she ended up giving in. When she discovered she was pregnant, the Mother Superior expelled her, and she swore she would get rid of the baby and return the next day. They found Sophia hanged on the tree near the building. The story seemed straight out of a horror movie, and after hearing it, my fear regarding what we experienced only increased. Since that conversation, I never had any desire to return to that church. My mother never knew the reason because she didn't understand why I didn't want to go back. To this day, I can't forget that terrifying experience and the vision of that sinister nun. Sometimes I wonder if she's still there, trapped in that place, as if the souls of those who take their own lives remain trapped where they committed the act. And here is someone who witnessed that this is real. What would you do if you were in my place, facing that nun? My name is Victoria, and I'm writing directly from Peru. I usually dedicate myself to creating mystery tales, but what I'm about to share with you is not fiction. It's something that really happened. This episode took place in my hometown, located in southern Peru, on September 20th, during a religious festival which my mother and I attended annually. As we are devoted to the saint celebrated on this date, we arrived on the eve, and the festivities were already in full swing. I vividly recall that night. We went out to watch the parade in the city center, and during the celebration, we ran into some acquaintances we hadn't seen in a long time. Among the vibrant colors of the costumes and the animated conversations, the hours flew by. It was in this environment that we received the sad news about our neighbor, Marcos. We were informed that he was hospitalized in serious condition, the victim of an illness he had suffered from for a long time, but had kept secret from almost everyone. His family was one of the richest and most well-known in the city, especially for us who lived on the same street. I remember well that they owned 2 houses across from each other, and in one of them, a small store operated where Don Marcos himself used to attend to customers. In the city, he was easily recognizable from a distance, a tall, robust man with a peculiar way of dressing. He was always in a shirt, a wool vest, fabric pants, and of course, that beret that was his trademark. When I looked at my phone that night, I saw it was almost 1 in the morning. I alerted my mother that it was late, and we decided to walk back home as the city was small. When we arrived, we realized we had forgotten the keys. With a bit of embarrassment, my mother began to look for her phone to call my grandmother and ask her to open the door. I also searched for mine in my purse, and upon checking the time again, it was now 1:45 in the morning. I was standing beside my mother when suddenly I saw a silhouette a few houses away. When I turned to observe better, I could distinguish the figure of a man standing on the sidewalk, staring fixedly at the door as if waiting to enter. At first, I thought it might be some neighbor, perhaps a bit drunk, returning home, but something caught my attention. That figure seemed familiar to me, although his face was obscured by the shadow of a very peculiar beret. I thought, it can't be him, I said to myself. Without hesitation, I took a few steps toward the man. He then turned to look at the house across the street, and it was then that I realized it was Don Marcos's house. He was standing in front of the door of his small store and slowly crossed the street toward his other house on the opposite side. I simply stood watching, attentive to every detail. There was something strange about that figure. It seemed like he was walking, but his movements were minimal, as if everything around him was slowed down. I was about to raise my hand to wave, when suddenly I felt someone grab my arm. I turned, startled, and saw my mother calling me to come in, saying they had opened the door. "Wait," I murmured. "He's over there," pointing toward the neighbor's house. "Who?" asked my mother, not understanding. When I looked back, only a thin silhouette remained, disappearing into the darkness of that poorly lit street. The following morning, right at dawn, we were awakened by knocks on the door. I went to answer and found our neighbors, all dressed in black, who came to invite us to Don Marcos's wake. They said he had passed away the night before. With some hesitation, I discreetly asked one of Don Marcos's nephews what time he had died, and he commented that his uncle had departed around 12:30. At that moment, I shared what I had seen only with my grandfather, who explained to me that this is common, that souls often make one last visit to their loved ones, or to the places where they lived before definitively departing. And before we go to the next story, I leave here a piece of advice. Stay alert to the sounds outside. That cry that seems to be just the wind may not be just that. For our safety, perhaps it's better not to risk it and avoid looking out the window. In a world where exhaustion from daily routines often leads people to seek simple solutions, like staying at a colleague's place to avoid a long commute, one can never predict what a night might hold. A change in the usual plan, an unfamiliar building, and what should be a safe environment can quickly become the stage for a frightening mystery. You know, that silence that seems to contain something more, an invisible weight. That's what this story is about. My name is Stella, and I decided to share this experience because ever since it happened, I've thought twice before accepting improvised overnight stays anywhere. Several weeks ago, we finished a long work marathon close to 2 in the morning. Since I live very far from the office, whenever we have such a late session and I need to be back early the next day, I usually spend the night at my boss's place, which is just a few blocks away. However, on that particular night, she still had to work until much later. So a colleague who lived about 20 minutes away suggested we share an Uber to her apartment, where I could spend the night. Her apartment was small, but she said I could make myself comfortable on the living room sofa, and I accepted without hesitation. After all, the alternatives were to wait indefinitely for my boss, or go home just to sleep for 2 or 3 hours before having to return. We called an Uber and quickly arrived at her place. The street was deserted and silent, perhaps too quiet. The surrounding buildings looked ancient, especially hers. Between 2 closed storefronts, there was a glass door with bars that seemed somewhat abandoned, but that's where we entered. The driver even asked if we were sure this was where we wanted to get out, and we said yes. He waited until we went inside before leaving. The first corridor was completely dark, with several closed doors that probably led to inactive establishments. I thought some automatic light would turn on with our movement, but nothing happened. My colleague mentioned that the elevator was broken, so we would have to climb the 4 floors on foot. At that moment, I thought it might have been better to sleep at the office. Most of the floors were immersed in total darkness, except for a small streak of light escaping from under a door at the end of the 2nd floor corridor. I asked her what was happening in the building, and she explained that it was about to undergo a complete renovation. It was owned by 2 brothers who had decided to modernize everything, which led to increased apartment rents. According to my colleague, their plan was to make the old tenants who paid lower rates leave, so they could rent the apartments at a much higher price to foreigners. Still, she wasn't planning to leave anytime soon. Since she had moved in more recently, she intended to enjoy every day stipulated in her contract. She still had 6 months until it ended. She mentioned that renovations had begun on the 1st floor, but were soon interrupted. It seemed the brothers had lost their rental income all at once, and ended up without money to continue the work. We climbed quickly, and as soon as we arrived, my friend went straight to take a shower. Meanwhile, I stayed in the kitchen preparing some coffee, as she suggested. I nibbled on some cookies and impulsively turned on the television while looking for a place to charge my phone. The knock on the door sounded strange. It seemed like whoever knocked had hesitated and then moved away. I heard footsteps receding and imagined that perhaps it was one of the few remaining tenants. suspicious of seeing an unfamiliar person entering the building and wanting to confirm that everything was in order. Soon, however, the footsteps echoed again, this time approaching down the corridor, followed by another knock. The shower was still running, and to avoid disturbing my friend, I approached to take a look through the peephole. However, when I got close, I saw no one. I found it all very odd, but I was about to return to where I was when a child's voice, a girl, called to me from behind the door, asking if her mother was there. An icy shiver ran through my body as I stared at the door, undecided whether to open it or not. I went to the handle, but before turning it, I decided to look once more through the peephole. Nothing. I forced my vision to try to see downward, but there was no sign of a child there. I thought it was just the product of accumulated fatigue. "Won't you open?" the voice returned, and this time I was sure it wasn't just an impression. Someone was playing a trick on me. Before I could decide what to do, my friend came out of the bathroom asking if I wanted to take a shower. I replied that I did, as I had already set aside my clothes. She seemed to notice I was acting strange and wanted to know if everything was okay. "A little girl knocked on the door," I commented. I didn't quite know how to explain the situation. She wrinkled her nose with a look of disgust and shook her head. "I know, but you didn't open it, right?" I confirmed that I hadn't and asked why she was asking. She just replied for me to let it go, take my shower, and she would explain later. I entered the bathroom, but that scene wouldn't leave my mind. Who would let a child walk alone through a building at that hour of the morning? It didn't make sense. What kind of place had I come to spend the night? After a while, I came out of the shower. My friend had said she was going to bed, but she was still in the kitchen. I asked why she hadn't gone to sleep, and she replied that sometimes sleep abandoned her. Something she hated about living there, especially on nights like this when she had to get up early for work. I took the opportunity to ask again about the girl, wanting to know how they allowed a child to walk alone through the building so late. Was someone really leaving her unaccompanied at night? Or was the mother simply not responsible? She signaled for me to wait, remained silent, and approached the door, peeping through the peephole. Then she returned to where I was and said very slowly, "There is no little girl. This building is empty." I let out a laugh, not understanding if she was trying to joke with me, but it definitely wasn't the time for jokes, and honestly, I didn't find it the least bit funny. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked. I replied that I didn't because I had just heard a girl. She went to her bedroom and advised me to try to sleep, ignoring any sounds that came from the corridor, and above all, under no circumstances to open the door. She entered the bedroom, and immediately after, I heard relaxing music starting to play softly. I don't know if it was to help her sleep or to muffle any external noise. I lay down on the sofa, already prepared for the night. But every time sleep began to overcome me, I heard the girl's voice outside again, asking if I would let her in. Upon hearing it, I would wake up completely, pay attention, and then the silence would return. Finally, around 5 in the morning, I woke again, but this time it wasn't because of the girl. What woke me was the sound of someone trying to turn the doorknob slowly, as if trying not to make noise so as not to alert anyone. The shock ran through me like lightning, and adrenaline took over. From my friend's bedroom, The music was still coming at the same soft volume as before, so I knew she wouldn't hear anything. I got up carefully, walking on tiptoe so as not to produce any noise. I approached the door, my heart racing, afraid that there was someone watching, someone who might see the shadow of my face approaching the peephole. When I peeked, I saw something, but not exactly near the door. It was a bit further away, a few meters down the corridor. In the dim light, I could barely distinguish the figure, but it looked like a young man, or perhaps a man. It was very tall and had an absurdly pale face, white as a mask, with a disproportionately long, distorted, almost grotesque chin. It was smiling, but it was that lifeless, forced smile while the eyes remained empty. A slight sound of surprise escaped me before I could control it, and at that same instant, it turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness of the corridor. I spent the rest of the night awake, waiting for time to pass. When I saw the sky beginning to lighten, a relief calmed me a little. As soon as my friend woke up, I told her what had happened. She said it was impossible, that there was no one else in the building that night. According to her, it could only have been a dream, a nightmare with all I had heard. She assured me she had never seen anything like it. But how could it have been a dream if I had barely closed my eyes? Exhausted and in a bad mood, I got ready for work. I don't think I had ever felt so afraid in my entire life. And now, if by chance I have to stay late again next month, I've already decided I'd rather pay for a hotel or call a taxi to go to my home than return to spend the night in that place. And if by chance you hear a little girl knocking on your door tonight, don't open it. It might be that he is there. I have no doubt that most people who hear this story will identify with what I'm about to tell. I wish I had paid more attention to the warning signs about a certain romantic partner. I imagine we've all had problematic relationships, but in my case, one in particular could have permanently marked my life. When I met Daniel, it was as if I had been transported into a dream. He presented himself as a transparent man, like a book without blank pages. Besides being charming and good-humored, he was a figure of undeniable beauty, tall, athletic, with a well-groomed beard and a dazzling smile highlighted by impeccable white teeth. I know attraction is very subjective, but objectively speaking, Daniel was the type who attracted attention wherever he went. People were enchanted by him as soon as they met him. Daniel had that friendly and engaging manner, capable of winning over anyone. We went out a few times, but to be honest, nothing blossomed immediately. Despite all these qualities that I admired, I didn't feel there was a special connection between us. We talked about it, and he accepted the situation without resentment. We remained friends, and each followed our own path regarding relationships. However, as the months passed, our friendship strengthened. We spoke openly about our love lives in my case, about the absence of one, and exchanged advice. Daniel became a truly dear friend, someone I valued more than anyone else around me at that time. Several years passed, and one day he started dating a woman. After that, he disappeared from social media and practically stopped talking to me. I didn't take it personally. After all, our communication wasn't that frequent anymore. Shortly after, he completely disappeared from sight. I would still occasionally run into him at bars, but that also became rare. His phone was out of service, and he remained off social media. One night, while I was at a bar, I heard some people commenting about Daniel. They said his breakup with his girlfriend had been terrible, and that he had decided to move away to start over. I felt sorry for him, along with slight frustration that he hadn't reached out to me to vent, even though we had drifted apart. I certainly would have supported him if he needed it. Life went on, and with time, I ended up forgetting about Daniel until one night, a Friday. There I was at my usual bar with my friends when the door opened, and as if in a movie scene, Daniel walked in. He seemed the same as always, with that charm that never failed to attract glances. I left the conversation with my group and ran to hug him. We spent the night reminiscing about stories, as if time hadn't passed. One thing I noticed afterward was that he never got up once to get a drink. At that moment, I didn't give importance to this detail, but how I wish I had noticed. We ended up going to my place together, and that night, for the first time in all the years I had known Daniel, we kissed. This kiss finally paved the way for new encounters, and I decided to give him a chance, now in a way that went beyond friendship. Having just gotten out of a recent relationship, I was still fragile and emotionally sensitive. Perhaps it was coincidence, but Daniel returned to the city at the exact moment when I was most vulnerable. On one hand, I felt our relationship made sense, but deep down, something kept reminding me of that first instinct of caution I had toward him. When we finally started dating, I noticed he avoided the bar where we always used to go. I found this request somewhat peculiar, but wasn't too concerned. After all, some people simply have preferences and avoid certain places. So we spent the first month without frequenting our old meeting spot. One night, my friends insisted that I join them at our usual bar. I mentioned to Daniel that I wanted to go, and he seemed to get tense, although he responded with only a dry whatever. He made it clear he didn't want to go, and honestly, I saw no problem with that. I'm not the type who needs to be glued to my boyfriend all the time. I went to the bar and met my friends around 9:30. Daniel said he would come to pick me up around midnight. As soon as I ordered a drink, the bartender gave me a strange look, something that seemed a mixture of surprise and discomfort. She took my order with some hesitation and returned with the drink without even looking at me. It was as if somehow I had done something to displease her, though I couldn't imagine what. I found it strange, but I shook my head and went back to enjoying the night with my friends. Every now and then, I would notice the bartender observing me, which made me a bit uneasy, but I tried to ignore it so it wouldn't ruin my night. Shortly before midnight, I went to the counter to close my tab, and before leaving, I decided to stop by the bathroom. While washing my hands, the bartender entered, closing the door behind her and locking it. For a second, I thought she was going to attack me. Her eyes were teary, and she looked at me with urgency. "You're Natalie, right?" she asked, her voice trembling. I felt myself responding with a cautious, "Yes." The bartender lowered her head and said in a desperate tone, "Please tell me you're not dating him. If you are, you need to end it." My initial reaction was defensive. I assumed she might be an ex, or perhaps just jealous. "Listen to me," she almost shouted, her voice laden with tension. She took a deep breath and continued, "I dated Daniel a few years ago. He always compared me to you, making comments like, 'Why can't you be more like Natalie?' Or Natalie would do it this way. And even when I'm with Natalie, with time, I began to hate you without ever having met you. Until one day, I found a folder full of photos of you on his computer. Hundreds, maybe thousands. He had pictures of you driving, walking, photos of you on dates, even photos taken from inside your house. When I confronted him, he freaked out, deleted everything, threatened me, and disappeared from the city. I never saw him again until the other day when he appeared at the bar. At that moment, something about you seemed familiar to me, but I only connected the dots when I saw Daniel again. My heart was racing at that moment. I didn't know whether to believe her, or if it was an exaggerated story. I asked why she hadn't gone to the police, but her response was evasive. Gradually, the feeling that perhaps she was just jealous took over, and I didn't take her story very seriously. It simply didn't seem like something Daniel would do. I thanked her for the warning and asked her to let me out of the bathroom. She unlocked the door and remained there, head down. I thought to myself, if this is a lie, this bartender deserves applause because she seemed genuinely terrified, trembling and pale as a ghost. Shortly after midnight, Daniel showed up with the car and I got in. On the way to his place, I felt comfortable sharing the story the bartender had told me. As soon as I finished relating what I had heard, he was silent for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Instead of denying everything, he simply responded, "I just loved you so much, Natalie." I looked at him, still focused on the road, and asked, "Are you saying this is true? That you really took all those photos of me?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he pressed his foot on the accelerator. I watched the speedometer and saw the speed climbing, 70, 80, 90 miles per hour. And before I could realize it, we were well above 100. I panicked and shouted for him to stop the car. There was a slight curve approaching on the road, but he continued straight, breaking through the barrier. The windshield shattered, and we began to roll down the hill. I believe my survival was thanks to the hill's inclination, as we lost speed as we descended. I blacked out for a brief moment, and when I regained my senses, I saw Daniel unconscious at the wheel. I had a cut on my head, bleeding, but maintained consciousness and felt no signs of a concussion. Somehow I managed to grab my phone and call emergency services. The rescue team arrived quickly, tended to my wounds, and when they removed Daniel from the car, he began to regain consciousness, although he was visibly confused and was taken to the hospital. Later, I reported everything to the police, explaining that my boyfriend had intentionally driven off the road at an insane speed. I also mentioned the photos, but they didn't seem to consider it relevant, at least not that I was informed. He was formally charged for the driving incident, and I made sure to file a complaint. I don't know if he really intended to kill us, or if he was completely out of his mind at that moment. I've known Daniel for many years, and would never have imagined he was capable of something like this. I consider myself fortunate to be alive, and I now realize I should have taken the bartender's warning about him seriously. Thank God Daniel is in jail, and I'm currently in contact with someone who is helping me investigate the issue of the photos he supposedly took of me. If this is confirmed, he could face additional, quite serious charges, which could significantly prolong the time he will spend incarcerated. Life has these things, doesn't it? Sometimes it takes you down unexpected paths, placing you in scenarios you never imagined and rekindling bonds you thought were lost. A few months ago, I decided to move to a new city about an hour away from where I spent my childhood. I found a home in a beautiful house situated in a quiet community, completely different from the busy neighborhood where I grew up. The most curious detail, and honestly the most extraordinary, about this move was discovering that my neighbor was actually someone from my past. Michael, my old childhood friend. If I had made a list of people I thought it unlikely to encounter again, his name would have been at the top. We grew up together, always part of the group that gathered to play ball, run around, ride bikes, and engage in typical mischief for our age. Among all the neighborhood kids, Michael was one of the closest to me. Back then, video games were just beginning to catch on, but in a very different way than we see today. Michael and I were the only ones fascinated by them, and we would spend hours inside playing, much more than the rest of our friends. Of course, we still went out to play with the group, but video games were our true passion. I even remember the nights he slept over at my house, and we would stay up playing into the early hours. However, everything changed when I was in 5th grade. Michael and his family moved away. We spoke a few times by phone, but the contact gradually faded, and we never managed to reconnect properly. When MySpace emerged, we added each other there, but he was already living a life elsewhere, and the distance seemed to have also taken away the affinities we shared. When Facebook became popular, I barely remembered Michael, and it didn't even cross my mind to look for him. To me, he had become a distant memory until the day when, upon moving, I discovered with surprise that my new neighbor was him. At first, it was great to see him again. We understood each other as if time hadn't passed, and it was a shock to know he was back on this side of the country. As a child, he had gone with his family to the West Coast, so I really didn't expect him to be living so close to where we grew up again. I asked what had brought him back, and he simply replied that he preferred life on the East Coast. After I settled in, I decided to invite Michael over for some beers and to talk about the time we spent apart. That night he showed up but brought 2 guests, a friend named Jason and Jason's girlfriend, Iris. I found it a bit unexpected for him to come accompanied without notice. It wasn't a question of me not liking the idea. It was just a matter of having the courtesy to ask first. As soon as the 3 of them entered, they began to act strangely. Jason and Iris seemed hypnotized by the objects in my living room, as if they were absorbing every detail. Their eyes scanned the environment with a strange focus, giving the sensation that they were mentally cataloging everything they saw. From time to time, I noticed the 2 of them whispering, exchanging impressions in an almost conspiratorial manner. It might seem like paranoia on my part, but an uncomfortable tightness began to grow in my stomach. At some point, I brought up the subject of video games with Michael. I asked if he still played anything. He gave me a look of disdain, laughing to himself with an arrogant, contemptuous expression. No way, man. I stopped playing video games around the age of 12. That's kid stuff. I gave an automatic laugh, trying to mirror his tone. I leaned back in my chair and replied, "Well, I guess I didn't get that memo at 12. I not only still play, but work with games for a living." The room fell into a strange silence, followed by somewhat awkward laughter. But after I shared this information, I noticed the mood suddenly changed. Everyone seemed very interested, especially Jason, who began to ask quite specific questions, like whether the computer I had there in the living room was the same one I used for work. Yes, I worked at a studio for my main source of income, but I spent a good part of my free time developing an indie game on my own computer at home. I told them all this, going into details that I might not have mentioned in a casual conversation. After a few more exchanges of words, we called it a night. The next day, as I was leaving to take care of some things, I saw Michael outside. I waved to him, but his response was somewhat cold, and he seemed bothered by something. That night, I stayed home and dedicated myself to my game until late. It was past 2 in the morning when my cell phone notified me of an alert. Someone was at my door. I have a motion camera near the entrance, as well as a Ring doorbell camera. I opened the video and was perplexed by what I saw. There were 3 people standing in front of the door, all wearing masks and hoods. They were simple medical-type masks, nothing Halloween-like. They seemed to be discussing something among themselves. 2 were farther back, and one of them was positioned right in front of the door. This individual in front turned his back to the camera, hiding something behind his waist. He held what appeared to be a handle, and for a brief instant released enough for me to recognize what was there. Right after, he turned again and tried to turn the doorknob, checking if the door was locked. Thankfully, it was. He backed away, as if assessing the next step, and it was at this moment that one of the others seemed to notice the Ring camera. "Wait," a woman shouted. "Wait," and pointed directly at the camera. Upon hearing this, the intruder who was closest to the door ducked down and stared directly at the camera. Even with the mask, it was evident that it was Michael. The realization that it was him made me imagine that the other 2, who quickly ran off in the opposite direction from Michael's house, were his friends Jason and Iris, whom I had already met. Michael's eyes widened, as if he understood he had been caught in the act. Jason and Iris wasted no time and fled, while Michael hesitated a bit before taking a few steps back, only to try the doorknob one last time, shaking it forcefully in a desperate attempt to open the door. He muttered something I couldn't distinguish and then dashed away. Without delay, I contacted the police. I handed over the recordings and explained everything that had happened. Michael disappeared for a few days, perhaps knowing the police were on his trail. But after a while, I saw him furtively returning to his house. I called the police again, and they arrived quickly. The investigation that followed linked Michael and his accomplices to a series of break-ins that had occurred in the region. The situation worsened for them when it was discovered that another residence they had invaded weeks before also had a Ring camera. On that occasion, however, they were without masks. It was painful to witness this outcome for someone with whom I shared so many good memories. Seeing an old friend descend down such a dark path affected me. But in the end, I owe my security to my motion camera and Ring camera. I learned the lesson to never think I'm immune to situations like this, regardless of where I live. My neighborhood is notoriously safe, practically without crime records, but if it weren't for those cameras, perhaps I wouldn't be here to tell this story. It was Valentine's Day, and we had arranged to meet downtown for coffee later. He suggested going to an observatory, and I, excited, accepted the idea. I just didn't imagine that the so-called observatory was more than an hour's bus ride away on the city outskirts. When we finally arrived, the sun was already saying goodbye on the horizon. To complicate matters, we discovered that it would be necessary to cross a trail in the forest and climb a hill to get there. Dressed in a light summer outfit, I was shivering from the cold, and to make it worse, walking through the woods in high-heeled shoes was absolute torture. With each stumble on the dark and deserted trail, I tried to maintain light conversation, but it wasn't an easy task. He, in turn, was apparently more interested in communicating with the trees, and only gave me icy glances whenever I opened my mouth. At this point, I already saw myself as a future newspaper headline. Someone would find my body frozen at some point in that forest. Finally, we reached the observatory, and I was already on the verge of breaking down in tears, torn between begging for my life or coming up with a plan to get rid of him before the worst happened. My joy was immense when I saw another couple up there. Honestly, I didn't even mind when he started talking about all the UFOs that, believe it or not, he swore he was seeing. I apologize if this text sounds strange, as I've never tried to express these thoughts in words before. I think I'm seeking general advice. To contextualize, I live with my girlfriend, and I love her very much. However, I'm afraid she's no longer the same person as before. We've been together for almost 10 years, starting our relationship in our senior year of high school, and we haven't separated since. We went through colleges in different cities, maintaining a firm relationship. After we graduated, we decided to live together and were happy like that, until recently. I know what most people tend to think, as I've already shared my concerns with some friends, and they all have similar responses. I hear things like, she's probably with someone else. She must be using drugs, or my favorite, she just doesn't love you anymore, man. If it were something like that, at least I'd have a concrete explanation. But I'm sure it's not that. Her behavior has changed, as if she's hiding something, but not another person. It seems like something darker and more disturbing. Let me start from the beginning to see if I can capture all the clues. Recently, I arrived home earlier than usual. This is uncommon for me, as I usually have fixed hours. When I entered, she was in the shower and didn't notice my arrival. However, as I approached the bathroom, I could hear her. She was grumbling and seemed annoyed, repeatedly cursing, sounding really irritated. I knocked on the door to see if everything was okay, and the cursing immediately stopped. After a moment of silence, she responded, saying she was fine. She took a long time to get out of the shower, and when she finally did, she seemed anxious and extremely tense. I asked again if everything was okay, but with an irritated tone, she replied yes, and asked me not to insist. I decided to respect that, and give her the space she seemed to need. She was never one to get upset with anyone, much less with me. Knowing her for almost 20 years and being her partner for nearly a decade, I'm sure this attitude is not part of who she is. The next morning, as I was preparing for work, I entered the shower and noticed something strange on the shelf where we keep our hygiene products. There was a mark of dried blood. Upon picking up the bottle, I saw there was a reddish ring underneath it. Looking more closely, I noticed dried remains and various stains in corners with residues around the shower. I was intrigued, but didn't get worried or anxious about it. Later, upon returning home, I found one of her new friends there, a woman named Alina, who always seemed a bit strange to me. To be honest, I never really liked Alina. I don't know exactly where they met. Perhaps they worked together. Or maybe she's one of my girlfriend's clients, I'm not sure. I just know she always caused me an uncomfortable impression. She likes to talk about problems she faced when she was young, and about the crazy things she did in her 20s. If I had to guess, I'd say Alina must be between 35 and 40 years old. That afternoon, when I entered the house, I noticed my girlfriend and Alina were behaving strangely. I noticed the laptop open on the kitchen table, and as soon as I entered, they quickly closed it, seeming to want me to leave. I felt something wasn't right. The expression on my girlfriend's face made that clear, but I preferred not to ask anything again. I went straight to the bedroom, closed the door to change clothes after work. Even so, I could hear Alina whispering to my girlfriend, and she seemed tense. Shortly after, I heard the sound of a door closing, and upon checking, I saw Alina leaving through my garage. My girlfriend has always been someone extroverted, cheerful to the maximum. But now, she seemed like a shadow of herself, like someone who hasn't slept for days. I was certain she was hiding something, but I didn't believe it was an affair with someone else. That doesn't match her character. Normally, I would never snoop, as we have a relationship based on trust. But upon opening the laptop, I noticed the last accessed page was still open. She was on a website looking for weapons, something that wasn't familiar to me, and that seemed extremely suspicious. It's important to mention that she has always been totally against weapons. So seeing her on such a page was something absolutely out of the ordinary. This led me to look at the browsing history, and what I found was, at the very least, strange. There were various articles about missing persons, and some pages with directions to what appeared to be a remote and isolated place. As the days went by, I noticed she became increasingly a shadow of who she was before. No smiles, no laughter, no moments of intimacy, as if her essence had also disappeared. I also began to observe peculiar details, such as her shoes covered in mud, her cell phone almost always turned off, and the computer that mysteriously broke the day after my investigation of the history. I saw Alina again a few days ago. Upon arriving from work, I noticed her car parked outside with the engine running and full of suitcases. I entered, and Alina seemed irritated. She gave me a look, and then looked back at my girlfriend without saying anything. She sighed, left, and departed with the car. As soon as she was gone, my girlfriend was pale, almost colorless, and sat on the sofa. I asked once more if everything was okay, and she replied, "I will be fine soon. Alina doesn't matter. I will be fine soon, I promise." I've tried to decipher this phrase a million times, and still, I can't fully understand what she meant. It's been a few days since Alina left, but my girlfriend remains unrecognizable. She's on personal leave, so she hasn't left the house for days. At first, I imagined there might be something romantic between them, but when I brought up the subject, she denied it emphatically. After some discussions, she asked me to drop the subject and stop asking questions. Her look when telling me this was that of a person I barely recognized. I don't know what's happening, but I feel like my girlfriend, my best friend, is trapped somewhere distant from her own mind. She's no longer the same person I fell in love with, and with whom I shared so much time. If anyone is reading this, I just ask that you share some advice. I've already tried everything that came to mind, and I'm beginning to fear that she might have done something terrible. If this situation evolves, or if I have news, I'll try to update you by email. Meanwhile, all I can do is maintain hope and pray that my girlfriend regains peace, and that these frightening thoughts roaming my mind are just dark fantasies with no foundation in reality. I spent my early years living outside the lines of the law. I never finished my studies, dropping out of high school in my sophomore year, a choice that, with time, became a great regret. At 20, I was arrested for the first time, and unfortunately, that wouldn't be my last stint in prison. My entire youth in my 20s was marked by comings and goings between freedom and incarceration. Upon turning 30, I decided to give my life a different direction. That's when I realized I lacked true friendships and any sense of direction. I sought answers in various churches and community clubs, trying to find my purpose. In this process, I found Marcus. He was like an anchor in my life, especially during that moment of uncertainties. I met Marcus at a church event. He described himself as agnostic, which surprised me since we were at a religious event. But Marcus explained that he participated in these gatherings because of the sense of community. For him, those people were incredibly welcoming, and there was no other place where he felt such affection. And he was right. The environment offered a unique acceptance. I was never very connected to religion, and I'm not even sure what church that was, but one thing was clear. The people there were fantastic. Everyone loved Marcus, even the congregation leaders. No one cared about his doubts regarding faith. He was beloved regardless. Marcus made an enormous difference in those people's lives. He was always ready to help in some way, donating clothes, food, and most importantly, his time. I never understood where his money came from, but he had resources and used them to do good. He helped the poorest and encouraged everyone to participate in church events. On the front line, he served meals to the needy and drove to the most deprived areas of the city to offer whatever was within his reach. Marcus, from any angle you looked at him, was an exceptional person. In my search for meaning, I naturally grew closer to Marcus. With generosity and without judgment, he welcomed me, and I quickly became his community action partner. Accompanying him gave me a kind of new identity, as if my past ceased to matter. No one wanted to know who I had been before. They only saw what I was trying to be now. This new life alongside Marcus continued for a few years. He became more than a partner, a true friend. When I had nowhere to live, Marcus offered me a small guest house. We would wake up early, start our day, and travel the city helping where we could, with him financing everything. It seemed his money had no end, and I never questioned this. One afternoon, while we were organizing a charity event, I noticed for the first time that something was strange with Marcus. That man, always so full of life and energy, seemed distant, almost absent. Later, when we returned to his house, I asked if everything was okay. He just took a deep breath let out a heavy sigh, and replied that yes, he was fine, but it was evident that something was deeply bothering him. That night, I observed through the window of the small guest house, situated a few steps behind Marcus's main house. The lights in his house were on, and the open curtains allowed me to see the interior with some clarity. From about 50 feet away, I could see, but couldn't capture enough details to know if he was really okay. Perhaps it was just an uncomfortable feeling, but something in my intuition, honed by experience with tense situations, told me that Marcus was about to crumble. I knew well that breaking point, the same one that had so often got me into trouble. I thought about it for a few moments, and in the end, decided to go to him just to ensure everything was in order. After all, he had done a lot for me. The least I could do was check. I crossed the lawn that separated my house from his. When I approached, I heard loud voices, shouting. It was Marcus in a full explosion. Drawing closer more slowly, I heard his furious voice. He must have been on the phone because there was no one else speaking, just him. His voice was laden with anger, something I had never witnessed in him. Strong words, shouts, cursing. It was hard to believe all of that was coming from Marcus's mouth. I moved silently to one of the side windows to try to peek inside. He was walking back and forth, holding the phone tightly. I heard him say clearly, "I don't care if you can't resolve this. I'll find someone who can. I won't put up with this crap day after day, without results. Fix this quickly so I can get out of this hellhole." Those were the exact words he uttered. At that moment, I had no idea what it meant. Right after, he hung up the phone furiously and threw it against the wall, letting out a final scream. It was then that he turned and caught me spying through the window. I tried to dodge, but it was too late. He had seen me. I lay down next to the side of the house, hoping he wouldn't come out. The illusion didn't last long, as I soon heard the front door open with a bang, followed by Marcus calling my name loudly. I stood up, feeling completely exposed. Part of me thought he would understand, that there would be no problem. After all, he had always been patient and understanding with me. But this time, I was completely wrong. With surprising strength, the corpulent man grabbed the collar of my shirt and pushed me against the wall of the house. His screams were so intense that I could feel the saliva hitting my face. "After everything I've done for you, and you're here meddling in my personal affairs." I remained silent, not knowing how to react. I tried to gather the strength to explain that I just wanted to make sure he was okay, but the words wouldn't come out. He released me with a push that threw me to the ground, and then he shouted, "It was you, wasn't it? It's you who's trying to get your hands on my money." I raised my hands in defense, sincerely claiming that I didn't know what he was talking about. As I tried to get up, he pushed me again, and this time he delivered a direct kick to my face, shouting, "Stay there." He went back into the house, slamming the door hard as he entered. The kick left me dazed for a few moments. My vision became blurry, and stars danced before my eyes. With effort, I regained focus and stood up again. When I peeked through the window, I saw Marcus messing with a chest in the living room. He seemed to be taking something out of it, but I couldn't exactly identify what it was. I just perceived that it seemed heavy. Not wanting to risk it, I ran back to the guest house, quickly gathered some essential belongings, and fled to the forest that surrounded his property. I hid among the trees, observing from a distance as Marcus wandered around the guest house, and at one point forced his way in through the door. He called my name, shouting, ordering me to come out of hiding, and was holding some object in his hands. It looked long and narrow, something he used to force the doors. He finally approached the edge of the forest, while I carefully moved between the trees. He continued to shout, which helped cover the sounds of my footsteps. I took the opportunity to move farther and farther away. Soon I reached the road and ran as fast as I could without looking back. From time to time, I glanced over my shoulder, but I never saw him coming after me. When I finally reached a convenience store, I asked the attendant to call the police, as I didn't have a cell phone at that time. As soon as the police arrived, I told them everything that had happened. I wasn't sure if they could do anything, but technically, Marcus had assaulted me and then chased me, so I felt I was in danger. They went to his house, and shortly after, I was informed that Marcus had been arrested. I never knew the exact reason for the arrest, as no one gave me details. But when I tried to search for information about him on the internet, nothing appeared. This makes me believe that Marcus was using a fake name. I spent years alongside this man, and even lived practically in his backyard. But I never noticed any indication that he was hiding something or had a violent side. Whatever secret he was keeping seemed to have finally come to the surface dramatically. I don't know if he planned to hurt me more that night, but the assault I suffered, there was enough to put me on alert. Does anyone have any idea what Marcus could have been involved in, or what secret he was trying to protect? I just want answers. Sometimes it's the people who seem the best who carry the deepest shadows. I never thought it would end like this. My truck's windows smashed, blood all over the interior. The frigid wind and snow blowing in on me as those two empty eyes stared in at me like a predator, sizing up a helpless animal for the kill. It didn't start out like that, of course. When I started out for my morning run, it wasn't snowing. There was snow on the ground. There had been a quick storm with some squalls that left half a foot of the white stuff on the roads just a few days earlier. The state took care of it pretty quickly, and travel was barely interrupted. Everyone was going about their merry way, even me. The fact that I hated winter, even more than driving a truck, never entered my mind. Okay, that was a lie. As I drove down the road, I found myself looking at the small piles of snow along the roadside and cursing them for not being big enough to cancel my run. I had to drive my truck through some pretty empty places, the kind that made you long for anything to break up the monotony of 2 lanes of asphalt, surrounded by endless trees. I had to drive that route quite often, and it never got any easier to stay awake. I would even imagine seeing odd things looking out of the trees as I flew by. I knew it was my mind playing tricks on me, trying to scare me into staying alert and not crashing the truck. If it had been a deer or bear or something like that, I would have just laughed it off. But this thing looked like it was out of some nightmare. That's how I knew it wasn't real. There was no way it could exist. So I put it out of my mind and kept on driving. Fortunately, with it being a 2-day run, I was able to pick up where I wanted to stay after I got my load. Hotels were nice, but if needed, I had the sleeper in my cab, which I called home away from home. It wasn't bad as cramped spaces go. There was lots of shelf space above the bunk. I had a TV mounted on the wall hooked up to a GameCube. There was a DVD player with an assortment of movies that I rotated out on a weekly basis. And there were some paperback books. I didn't have to worry about being bored. The only thing I really needed was food and a bathroom. I had snacks stashed around, sometimes in places even I didn't find for months. But it couldn't compare to a nice hot meal. I had my favorite stops on the road, and they all had two things in common: good food and a quiet place to park and sleep. I didn't like having my truck squashed up against other trucks, wondering if I would be able to get my door open if they parked like an idiot. I liked parking near the outskirts of a parking lot. It was more private, and I didn't feel as hemmed in. Of course, there was a trade-off. More privacy meant walking further to get to the truck stop. Sometimes a lot further, but I used that to my advantage. Nothing like a nice long walk to get the blood flowing to all the muscles I didn't use when driving. Unfortunately, the place was a local mom and pop operation, which meant they didn't have the money to stay open 24 hours a day. Usually, I would pull my truck into my spot in the evening, go get supper at the lunch counter, then grab supplies for the night. I'd always go inside one last time to use the restroom just before they closed at midnight. That evening, I followed the same pattern. Pulled in, walked to the store, got some supper, and went back in around 11:30 for the restroom and supplies before going back to my truck and falling asleep. Normally, I try to keep a good watch on upcoming weather. For whatever reason, I hadn't that day. I woke up around 8 a.m. and looked out to a sea of white. It had snowed, and it had snowed hard. It looked like someone wanted to make up for the snow quota this winter, and did it all in 8 hours. I dressed in my cold weather gear and went out to see how bad it was, and if my truck would be going anywhere today. When I jumped out of the cab, my legs disappeared. There was at least 2 feet of snow on the ground, and it was still putting it down. I trudged around the truck to make sure everything was okay, then got back in the cab, brushing off as much snow as I could first. I climbed into the bunk and turned on the news to the announcement that a major blizzard had hit the area. Well, I thought, that's some great investigative reporting right there. They were calling for another foot before the snow stopped. Great. Time to call the boss and get my ear chewed off. Why can't you get here? He growled. There's this stuff called snow, I said. It lands on the ground and piles up until it begins to impede travel. All right, smartass. When do you think you can be here? Well, seeing that I haven't even seen a snow plow go by, and I'm sitting in a parking lot that probably won't get plowed out until much later than the highways. On top of that, my tires are nearly bald even though I've been telling you for months that they needed changing. I'll say I have no earthly clue when you'll see your precious cargo. He was silent for a long moment. Do you like your job? He said through barely restrained fury. Not particularly, I said, then added, when the weather's like this, you might want to update your resume. With that, the line went dead. Thank you for your support, I said to the dial tone. I settled back in, turned off the TV, and went back to sleep. When I first started out trucking, a fellow driver gave me a tip that I never forgot. Anytime you have the chance to get some rest, take it. That little tidbit helped me tremendously over the years. A little extra sleep means a lot less coffee. When I woke up a few hours later and peeked outside, it was still snowing. I looked out my driver's side window, and even my tracks were gone. I was feeling the call of nature, and decided to brave the elements to take the trek to the truck stop for some relief. I felt a little silly for putting on all my cold weather gear, including my gloves and goggles. That feeling didn't last long. It was snowing so hard I couldn't even see the truck stop. I drew an invisible line with the side of my truck, aimed in that direction, and started walking. I never read Call of the Wild. I never saw Alive. Maybe if I had, I wouldn't have been so eager to throw myself out into this blizzard just to go pee. Trudging through the snow and the driving wind was growing old quickly. I felt like I should have reached the truck stop by now. I paused and looked around. Two realizations hit me at the same time. First, I couldn't see the truck stop. Second, I could no longer see the truck. As a lovely addition, my tracks were quickly disappearing. I tried to focus on my path toward the truck stop and began trudging again. 15 minutes later, I believe by sheer luck, I saw the store appear off to the right. My track hadn't been dead on, but I was close enough to find the place. My winter gear was starting to fail me, especially with the wind finding all the little places it could inject frigid air. As I approached, I breathed a sigh of relief at getting in out of the cold, not to mention a massive cup of steaming hot coffee. I reached for the front door, but it refused to open. Maybe it was frozen shut. I pulled harder, but nothing happened. I looked in through the glass and saw no lights on. It struck me how the walkway wasn't shoveled either. Oh no, I thought, the storm has them stuck at home. My hopes for a nice warm toilet and a steaming hot cup of coffee plummeted. I took one last forlorn look at the dark store and turned back toward my truck. My disappointment grew as I realized my tracks were gone. I was now snow-blind and navigating without a compass or any other means of direction. I tried to draw an invisible line with the outer wall of the store and hoped it would lead me back to my truck. I felt my cold, wet feet protest as I headed back toward the warmth of my truck. I hugged my jacket, attempting to keep the wind out. The snow was up past my knees now and seemed like trudging through mud. In retrospect, it would have been better for me to wait in the truck until I saw a snow plow in the parking lot. I had plenty of empty bottles for bathroom emergencies, but there was no use chiding myself now. I had to get back to the truck to keep this mistake from becoming a fatal one. If I got lost and couldn't find the truck, no one would come looking for me. They might not find my frozen body until spring thaw. That was a cheery thought, as if my journey hadn't been hard enough. After a while, something caught my foot and sent me sprawling face first in the snow. I struggled to right myself and quickly wiped the snow from my face, silently thanking God that I had worn the goggles. I tried to get my bearings again. Curiosity nagged at me. What had I tripped on in the middle of a parking lot? I dug down and discovered the offending object. It was a parking space barrier. I chuckled for a moment, until I realized to my horror that I should never have come near any of these in the middle of the lot. In fact, a straight trail from the store to the truck. The barrier I had tripped on would be a couple of dozen yards to the right. I scraped the rest of it off and saw it was running nearly parallel to my path. I had veered off course badly. The bright side was I now had a point of reference and hopefully could correct my course. I looked around and found myself adrift in a sea of white. The store had disappeared, and the truck was nowhere to be found. I took a deep breath and used the barrier to aim toward where the truck should be. I remembered one key fact in the process. These barriers lined the edge of the parking lot, and just past them was a drop-off. In retrospect, it was lucky I tripped on it instead of stepping over it and rolling down a hill that I might never make it back up again. I turned to aim myself where I thought my truck was when out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shadow of a figure walk by. I couldn't be sure because the blowing snow made visibility nearly impossible more than a few yards away. It could have just been my imagination. I'd been out in the cold for much longer than I planned, and it was time to get back to the truck. I was suddenly reminded why I got out of the truck to begin with. I had to pee so badly, I did a quick look and saw nothing but snow. So I whipped it out and let it go. I think whipped it out was a bit of an oversimplification. I fought to unzip my frozen zipper as my bladder screamed a full red alert that it was about to release the floodgates, whether I was ready or not. I finally got it out and started the yellow stream when the wind shifted direction, sending it spraying all over my pants. I quickly turned so that the stream was downwind. When I finished, I looked down at the front of my now wet pants and swore internally. Yet another reason to find the truck quickly. Wet pants turned to frozen pants, turned to dangerous pants. I looked down at the barrier, now covered in flecks of yellow snow, and started on my new course. The snow had not let up one bit, and my energy started to wane, even though I'd just been standing around for the last 10 minutes. Trudging through nearly waist-high snow was making me more tired than I had been in a long time. The wind rushing in my ears tore away my hearing. There wasn't anything out here to listen to, and yet I thought I heard something. I looked around but only saw white. Was this my mind starting to play tricks on me like it did when I was driving and thought I saw the creature that doesn't exist peeking out at me from the trees? I turned back to my imagined destination, wondering if delusions were the first step in freezing to death. As if to answer, the wind hit me with a solid gust, knocking me down. If I didn't know better, I'd swear I felt a giant hand in the middle of my back before I fell. I looked up and saw nothing but snow swirling around, making mini tornadoes. I chuckled at the irony of them being called snow devils. I guess my own personal snow devil was pushing me around. I got up and started for the truck again. Every step felt like my feet were encased in concrete. I plodded on, trying to pull from whatever reserve energy I had to keep going. I couldn't die in the middle of a parking lot, just yards away from my nice warm truck. That would be the ultimate irony. I walked on, barely conscious, wanting only my 18-wheeled safe harbor from this merciless storm. My head was down. I wasn't even looking anymore. It didn't make any difference. Suddenly, I slammed into something and fell back. The snow was so deep, I just lay there, like a turtle unable to get off my back. I looked up and saw the thing that had hit me was the back corner of the truck. 2 feet to the right, and I would have missed it. I smiled, but it took a lot of energy. I focused everything I had into getting up. Adrenaline took care of the rest. I marched up to the driver's side door and reached into my pocket for the key to unlock it. I couldn't find the key. I ripped off my glove and searched again. Still no key. Despair smothered my mind. If I had dropped it one of the times I fell in the snow, it was lost forever. And so was I. I leaned against the truck door, so close and yet so far. I could almost feel the heat through it. I smashed my fist into my leg in frustration, but felt more pain than I should have. I patted the other pocket and felt a lump. I tore off my other glove and reached into the pocket, pulling out the holiest of holies, the key. Tears streamed down my face and quickly froze as I stuck the key in the lock and opened the door. It took every ounce of energy I had left to climb up into the cab and collapse into the driver's seat. A wave of heat washed over me. For the longest time, I just sat there, until I mustered the strength to start pulling off my cold, weather gear one piece at a time. I threw them into the passenger seat until I sat in my underwear only. I leaned my seat back and basked in the warmth that flowed over me like an ocean wave. I imagined sitting on a beach with the sun shining down on me and the water beckoning. I fell asleep like this. I woke to a sore back and stretched as best as I could in my seat, then looked out the windshield. The snow seemed to have let up a little bit, and the wind wasn't nearly as fierce as before. There was still no sign of a plow, and there was no way I was getting anywhere without one. Off in the distance, I could almost see the outline of the store. I wasn't going there again until the parking lot was plowed, but looking around, I couldn't imagine how long that might be. There was at least 3 feet of snow already on the ground, and it was still putting some down. I crawled into the bunk and covered up for a serious nap. Hours later, I was starting to feel refreshed. I rolled over and turned on the TV, trying to see how bad things were. I couldn't even pick up the local station, so I stuck in a movie. After it was done, I decided I should probably take stock of my supplies, since I might be here for a while. I had plenty of snacks, chips, pretzels, and jerky, among other things. As long as I didn't binge, I should have been fine. I had drinks in the mini fridge too, but water wasn't a concern. All I had to do was bring some snow inside and melt it. I only needed to check one last thing to make sure I could outlast this storm. I looked at the fuel gauge. I rubbed my eyes and looked at the fuel gauge again. I only had a quarter tank left. That might last, it might not, depending on how long it took to get plowed out. Obviously, once the plow freed me, I could drive 100 yards or so to a gas pump. As I was looking at the fuel gauge, my eyes drifted to the windshield and the field of white that stretched out in front of me. The snow had finally stopped. How long would that last? I had no idea. I could finally see the store clearly, but I could also clearly see that it remained closed. It was hard to believe anyone would be plowing that amount of snow anywhere. I guess that's why they had the drop-off along the edges of the parking lot. As I softly chuckled at my realization, my eyes caught movement. There was some kind of animal walking around in the parking lot. At first, I thought it was a deer because of the white horns on its head. But the longer I looked, the more I realized this creature was something else. It seemed bigger than any deer I'd ever seen. Its torso rode above the snow like it was a ship. Its face looked like it had wasted away to the bare skull, and it had massive teeth that went far beyond its jaw. It was rather haunting to look at. It was sniffing around in the snow. The more I thought about it, I began to realize that was probably the spot where I had taken a leak. I was mesmerized and horrified by this thing at the same time. I was nearly convinced my mind was playing tricks on me. When it looked right at me, my blood turned to ice. Its look pierced my soul. It made me wish I'd never come to this place. When it took its first step in my direction, I dove back into the sleeper and drew the curtain. I shook for reasons that had nothing to do with the temperature and was breathing in panicked gasps. What was that thing? Did I really see what I thought I saw? How could a creature like that exist? I tried to settle down and get my breathing back to normal, but my mind refused to let go of the image of that thing. I just imagined it, I told myself. It's just a deer roaming around out there. I told myself the same thing over and over until my mind finally believed it. However, I didn't look through the curtain to confirm it. I didn't call it denial. I called it not pushing my luck. I pulled out a pack of cheese crackers and turned on the first Die Hard movie to try and forget about the deer that's outside. I was 15 minutes into that movie when I felt the first nudge. I didn't know what else to call it. It felt like something just nudged my truck. It was almost like when a strong wind gust pushed the cab, but I didn't hear any wind outside. The two sides of my mind engaged in a shouting match over whether I should check it out or ignore it. Fear threw its 2 cents in, and ignore it won out until the second nudge. Actually, it was like the 5th or 6th nudge, until curiosity took over and made me go take a look. I peeked through the curtain and didn't see anything but snow through the windshield. I climbed out and looked through the passenger side window, but I saw nothing. I chided myself for my skittishness. When I looked through the driver's side window and saw a set of horns, I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but they were gone. There were tracks in the snow that looked like deer tracks, but only bigger. Or was that my imagination carrying me away again? I looked in the rear-view mirror and saw the creature poking at my tires with its horns. I was fairly sure it couldn't puncture one with just horns, but I didn't want to chance it. I reached down, grabbed my club, and reached for the door to scare it away. But again, it was gone. I was beginning to question my sanity. Was this thing real? Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Or was this creature toying with me, trying to draw me out of the truck? I closed the door and went back to my movie, but I couldn't get the creature out of my head. I was on pins and needles, waiting, listening, anticipating the next nudge. Before the movie was over, I fell into a fitful sleep. I was in a tall building, and there were bad guys everywhere. I had a machine gun, but had been better served hiding and picking them off one by one. I was sneaking up on one who was standing guard on an isolated floor when I turned the corner, and there stood the deer creature. It was massive, standing on its hind legs, and its horns scraped the ceiling. It looked at me with those empty eye sockets from its bare skull face. It made a sound that was half grunt, half growl, then started towards me. I backed away around the corner, trying to get back to my hiding space. But as I turned to run, suddenly the creature was in front of me. I pulled up my machine gun and started firing short bursts. I hit it in the chest, but it kept coming. As I backed away, I shot it several times in the head. I watched as chunks of bone flew, but it kept coming at me as if it didn't care. I shot at its legs, hoping to throw it off balance, but it had no effect. As if it had had enough, it charged, pinning me to a wall with its horns. I looked down as the blood began to seep from my belly, around its horns. It pulled back and charged me again and again, sending shock waves of pain through my body and crushing my spine. It pulled back and allowed me to fall to the floor. Blood pooled around me as I tried to crawl away from the creature. I could only use my arms. I couldn't feel anything below my waist, which was a partial blessing because it cut my pain in half. After I'd crawled a few feet, I suppose it had enough of toying with me. It stomped its foot down on my neck so hard I heard a snap, and my arms went dead. I could feel it tear into my back, ripping away pieces of meat. I could hear the sickening chewing and slurping as I was eaten alive. I woke with a start, sweat pouring from my forehead, and looked around the sleeper cab looking for the creature that was tearing me to pieces. After a few seconds, I came to the realization it had been a nightmare. I turned off my DVD player and stuck my head out through the curtain to check on my fuel situation. The needle was below the quarter mark, almost down to an eighth. I looked out through the windshield. The snow had not magically melted. In fact, the wind had picked up, and now it was starting to drift. Where there was once an even field of snow, now there were peaks and valleys forming like dunes in the desert. The storm was still dark, and there was no traffic moving on the road. The sun was riding low in the sky, and I had yet to see another living soul. I wondered if my fuel would last until a plow could rescue me. Soon I would have to give some serious thought to conserving it. It wasn't ideal. The thought of bundling up in blankets in the dark with no heater and no TV to watch wasn't exciting me. But it was better than waiting until my fuel ran out and I froze to death. As I killed the engine, I chided myself for not coming up with this plan sooner. I would have conserved fuel when the sun was out and the temperatures were higher. Now I was going to pay for my lack of foresight. I dug out every blanket I had stored in my closets and laid them over the bed, then tucked in for a long nap. When I woke, I was drowning in utter darkness. I panicked for a moment before I remembered where I was. I looked at my watch, and it was 4 a.m. I pulled the covers off me and was immediately assaulted by cold air. I grabbed a flashlight and found my way into the cab. I turned the key on and waited with bated breath that billowed out in clouds that filled the cab until the engine turned over. As it roared to life, I felt even colder. I looked to my left and froze. My driver's side window lay in pieces on the seat and floor. I slowly turned to look at the passenger side window when fear grabbed me. There was a face looking in at me, but it wasn't a human face. It was the ungodly face of the dear creature that had gored me to death in my dream. A river ran down my leg, forming a yellow puddle on the floor as I stared into the dark, hollow eyes of this thing sent straight from hell. It reared its head back and then smashed into my passenger's window, splintering it. It reared back again, and this time shattered the window, reaching in for me with its fierce, long teeth. I jumped back and landed in the driver's seat full of glass. I knew I was dead. There was nothing I could do. I sat there as it entered the cab, coming for me. Its head was halfway inside when it suddenly stopped. It moved around a bit, then roared in frustration. Its horns were too wide to fit in the window. It tried over and over to get in, but there was no way it could fit with those horns. As suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. I looked around to see where it had gone, but the darkness of night covered it like a shroud. As I was looking, It silently reached behind me and would have had me if it hadn't breathed out, warning me of its approach. I dove into the center console as its deadly jaw snapped shut right where my spine had been. It continued its assault on this window, gaining ferocity as it frustrated itself by not being able to get a hold of me where I stood in between the two windows, hoping I was safe from either direction. It was then I decided to go back into my bunk and close the curtain. I covered up and reached underneath the bunk to a secret compartment and pulled out my .40 caliber automatic handgun. I took the magazine out and made sure it was loaded with all 10 rounds, then put it back in, pulled back the slide, and flicked on the safety. It made me feel a bit better, but not much. I didn't know how true my dream was, or if bullets would do anything to this monster. I no longer had any illusions that this was a deer. It was something much more dangerous and terrifying. And it was after me. I covered up with my blankets again, holding my gun close. The heater wasn't doing much good with 2 windows broken out. I would try to do something about them in the morning when it was light. There was no way I was doing anything in the dark with that thing lurking out there. I lay there for an hour watching every second of the clock tick by, eyes wide open, ears listening for any sound. But there was none, just the wind howling in between the 2 broken windows, making my curtains flutter. Eventually, I recognized the futility of having a truck running and the warm air just escaping before it could get to me. So I got out of my bunk, keeping my new best friend with me, and slowly made my way out to the cab, my head darting left and right to see if the creature was about to launch itself through either of the windows. I turned the key off, and before I could pull it out of the ignition, a set of horns smacked against the frame of the window, and the deadly teeth came in and snapped just inches short of my face. I whipped around and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. It snapped at me again, and I panicked until I realized the safety was on. I flicked it off and aimed, but the monster was gone. I didn't dare make a move toward the window for fear it would launch itself back in at me. I stood still as a statue and stared at the window it had come through, then slowly turned to the other side. I kept looking back and forth between the two, trying to keep my peripheral vision on both at the same time. I was shaking not only from the cold, but also from the sheer terror of not knowing where or when this thing was going to show itself. I decided my cold weather gear would be my best option, so I climbed back into the bunk and put on as many layers of clothes as I could find. When I popped my head back out, I was met with the most terrifying sight imaginable. The monster had climbed onto the hood of my truck and was now bashing its head against the windshield, trying to make its way inside. I knew the windshield was wide enough that it would be able to get its antlers inside, and I would be done. I pulled the gun up, aimed at its head, and fired. The explosion was massive. I instantly lost my hearing, except for the ringing in my ears. I staggered back, but the monster kept coming. Not only had my bullet done nothing to the monster, it weakened the windshield, making it easier to get inside. The monster shook its head in surprise when the bullet ricocheted off the bone, and then continued its assault on the windshield. It hammered on the glass until it shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. I was already aiming at its face and fired 2 shots before the glass even hit the floor. They both ricocheted off its skull, causing it to rear up just enough for me to fire 2 shots into its chest. It didn't collapse screaming in agony like I wanted, but I could tell it didn't like it either. It jumped down off the hood and disappeared. I stared out into the inky blackness, trying in vain to pick up any glimpse of it. I whipped around from one side window to the other and back again, waiting for it to show its horrid face. After what seemed like forever, I saw horns rising through the passenger side window. I fired a shot into its face, and it disappeared. I threw myself back into the passenger seat, when suddenly I saw its head rising in the driver's side window. I fired a shot, making it disappear again. I jumped up and threw myself to the other seat, knowing it would be on the passenger side soon. Sure enough, 10 seconds later it appeared, and I fired another shot. It was toying with me. It disappeared, and I threw myself over to the passenger seat, waiting, aiming at the empty driver's window. But instead, I felt teeth clamp down on my neck. It had fooled me. I shoved my gun up under its skull and fired a shot. If I hadn't been deaf from the first shot, this one right next to my ear would have done it. And yet somehow, I heard it squeal in pain as it released me. I knew I'd been inches from death. I reached up and touched the wound on my neck and came away with a handful of blood. I went back into my bunk, tore away pieces of sheet, and pressed it to my wound. Then I tore some more of the sheet and tied it around my neck to hold the bandage in place. I went back out to the cab only to see it crouching on the hood, waiting for me. I never thought it would end like this. My truck's windows smashed, blood all over the interior. The frigid wind and snow blowing in, as those 2 empty eyes stared in at me like a predator, sizing up a helpless animal for the kill. It crawled through the remains of the windshield. I knew I was dead. In desperation, I shoved the gun into one of its eye holes and squeezed the trigger. The sound it made was something I'd never heard before and never wanted to hear again. The scream was both a low guttural sound and a high-pitched shriek. It sounded like someone had unleashed a demon from the pits of hell. My mind screamed at me, "Get out of there." I fumbled with the driver's door and ended up falling out when it opened. On a clear day with no snow, I would have gotten a concussion or broken bone falling on the bare asphalt. With 3 feet of snow on the ground, I landed on a soft cloud pillow. It was the only time in the last 24 hours that the snow had helped me. I immediately jumped up and looked around for any place to hide, but there was nowhere. Everything was covered in snow. I glanced back at the trailer and realized the snow was so high that it reached the bottom of the trailer. I couldn't see underneath at all. I quickly dove under it, then turned around and tried to pile the snow into the opening to hide where I'd gone. I shone my light around at the beautiful sight of bare asphalt. I lay there on my belly, looking all around, trying to see in every direction at once to see where the monster would attack from. My breath blew out in billows of desperate smoke as I came up empty. There was nothing. The monster wasn't there yet. I didn't dare hope to imagine that my shot had killed it. If anything, it made it even angrier. It was probably destroying the inside of my truck at that very moment. What I didn't trust was that the monster wouldn't find me underneath the trailer. I looked around for anywhere I could use as a better hiding place. My eyes fell on the wheels of the truck. It looked like there was just enough room between the tires and the differential. It would be a tight squeeze, but it was better than that thing finding me. I turned around and slid my feet in first. The further I slid, the tighter it got. Ironically, the grease and oil from the differential helped me slide through a little easier. When I almost had my shoulders through, it suddenly felt too tight. I was stuck. I couldn't move forward or backward. Panic flooded my mind, and I struggled frantically like I couldn't breathe. After the longest minute of my life, I finally managed to maneuver my shoulders through and into my hiding spot. The hood of my coat did double duty of keeping me warm and completing my hiding place. I lowered it to the level of the asphalt and would raise it just an inch when I wanted to look out. The first half hour was the worst. The ringing in my ears had begun to subside, but I still didn't hear anything outside of my own breathing. The cold slowly leaked through my clothes. Still no sign of the monster. Another hour passed. My muscles started to cramp up. Still no sign of the monster. Another hour. I felt like my bladder would burst. Still no monster. During the long boredom in between, I pulled the magazine out of the gun and counted how many bullets I had left. No matter how many times I counted, it always came out to the same number, 1. I knew one bullet wouldn't save me from the monster. There was only one thing I could do with one bullet end my suffering if it found me. I took it out of the magazine and stared at it. I used my coat to shine it up, then stared at my reflection in the gleaming metal. The edges of the snow around the trailer began to glow. I knew the sun was coming up. Darkness was no longer my friend. I was about to give up and crawl out of my hiding place when I heard it. A soft sniffing sound. I lifted my hood up an inch, just enough to peek out, and there it was. Its head had broken through the wall of snow close to where I dove under the trailer. There were a few drops of blood from my neck wound, and it was sniffing them. Those drops would lead it right to me. Sure enough, it took a turn toward the front of the trailer and looked in my direction. I lay there still as stone as it inched its way toward me. It was having trouble squeezing its massive body under the trailer, and I could hear it growling with frustration. It came closer, crawling right toward me. There was no doubt it knew I was there. I closed my eyes and stuck the barrel of the gun under my chin. I felt its hot breath and smelled the stench of death as I squeezed the trigger. Suddenly it shrieked, and I could feel the truck bucking above me. I opened my eyes to the most amazing sight. Its horns had gotten caught in the chains hanging down underneath the trailer, and it was tangled. It screamed and bucked and fought to be free from its metal captors. It yanked backwards so hard, I felt the truck move sideways an inch. The differential was pressing on me now, and I had to shimmy over to avoid being crushed. I watched as the chains broke away one by one, and then it was free. I took the opportunity to crawl out from under the truck. It was a useless hiding place now. It had already tracked me. I was almost out when I heard another sound and saw a shadow pass by the other side of the truck. It was coming back, but it was trying from the other side. I crawled as quickly as I could. This was my chance. If it searched from the other side, it might not know I'd left. I had no idea where I would go, but it was better to be out of a useless hiding place. Besides, I desperately needed to stretch and pee. As I stood next to the truck, I saw a large patch of red in the snow. I guess shooting it wasn't as useless as I thought. I took care of business first, peeing before I ruined another pair of pants. I finished and thought about where to hide. I looked up at the ruined cab of my truck, and the nightmare crept around the corner. I stood there helpless. It had caught me flat-footed. I had nowhere to go. It stared at me as it limped around the corner. Its eyes seemed to exude rage. I pulled up the gun and aimed it when it disappeared in a moving mountain of snow. The snowplow had finally arrived. I watched as the plow pushed its mound of snow past my truck and over the edge of the parking lot. The driver backed up and stopped beside me. "You've been here all night?" the driver asked. "Since before the storm," I replied. "What happened to your truck?" he asked, looking up at my shattered windows. I followed his eyes and thought for a moment. "Someone tried to rob me," I lied, knowing the truth was unbelievable. "I see you took care of it," he said, looking at the gun in my hand. I looked down at the gun and stuck it in my waistband. "It's been one hell of a night," I said. "Well, don't worry. The roads are getting cleared, and I'll get you plowed out of here," he said to me. "Thanks," I replied. He nodded and backed up to continue plowing. I looked at where he just plowed beside my truck and saw a long smear of red. I followed it to the edge of the parking lot and looked over the side with my hand on my gun. The drop-off was a good 10 feet or more, and the snow had already started to pile up. I followed the path of red down the hill with my eyes and saw antlers poking out of the snow. I stared at them, looking for any movement. For 10 minutes I watched, and they didn't move. I was interrupted when the plow pushed another pile of snow over the side, covering the antlers. I watched for another 5 minutes just to be sure. The plow guy pulled up beside me. "You okay?" he asked, and I pulled my eyes away from the snow pile. "Yeah, I'm good," I replied. "Are you sure?" he continued, pointing at my neck. "Yeah, I just got nicked by some glass," I said, remembering the teeth of the monster clamping down on my neck. "Well, I think someone just pulled into the store," he said. "Maybe you should get something for that." "I will." "Thanks," I said, knowing I would do no such thing. I wanted to avoid as many questions as possible. I climbed into the cab, brushed the glass off my seat, and drove over to the fuel pumps. After filling up, I started the long trip home. I kept my cold weather gear and mask on. Having no windows or windshield made for a frigid trip. The heater was on max and aimed at my feet, keeping the bottom half of me warm. I didn't call for a tow truck because I wanted to get away from there. I never went back to that truck stop again. I didn't want to take the chance of that thing being alive. I never told anyone else about the harrowing encounter. I wish I could erase it from my mind. As I drove towards my home terminal through the endless stretch of trees, I saw one of the creatures peeking out at me that I used to think was my imagination. Now I know better. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.